Welcome. We're going to review some S1H footage alongside some GH5 footage that I've been shooting over the past couple days. Now, the GH5 I've been shooting with for a long time, basically since it came out, and the GH4 before that, but the S1H is a rental. I didn't decide to purchase one when it came out, and although I've been considering it for a while, it still hasn't grab me in the same way that the GH4 and GH5 obviously did. The S1H seems kind of like a decent update, but I was just really hesitant until I actually got my hands on it. So I figured I'd take the time to rent it to at least see if it's worth the upgrade, because it is kind of in a lot of ways an upgrade from the GH5. And that's the approach I'm going to be kind of coming at this from someone who's been shooting with the GH5 and now is considering maybe an S1H. So if you're a Sony shooter or a Canon shooter, I'm not really going to get into too much of that comparison, just kind of looking at the GH5 and if it's worth it to upgrade to the S1H. Hopefully this looks and sounds good. If it doesn't, please let me know. Live streaming, it can always be your hit or miss. And we're going to be in Premiere, so playback might also be an issue. But aside from that, hopefully it all looks and sounds good. Just let me know if anything looks out of place. We'll pop over to Premiere. Here you see my face. This was pretty much the first thing I shot with the S1H, and it was purely an autofocus test, kind of vlog style. And I've got this adjustment layer here for color correction with a LUT on it. It's one of the VariCam LUTs. So over on Panasonic's website, you can download the LUT library for the VariCams. Color grading is very, very subjective. So I just wanted to go with the stuff kind of right out of the box, and we'll kind of get a baseline of what these cameras can do based on the kind of, from Panasonic, this isn't any like funny shenanigans where it's my LUT and I mess something up. It's like, this is from Panasonic. I didn't want to get into arguing over like what color looks good or bad. So you can download these LUTs and kind of apply them right to Vlog as well as Vlog L, because both of those are they're actually made so that you can apply the same LUTs to them. And we'll get into that in a little bit and you'll be able to see that kind of in action. But right now I have on this color adjustment layer, I've got the, I put it on the creative section because you'll see why in a second, but I've just got the aggressive LUT on here. And if I activate this layer, you'll be able to see a much more contrasty saturated image. We all know log to kind of, proper display color, Rec 709, that it's going to make some big changes based on the normal log profile and then to the graded version. Obviously, this is underexposed based on how it was shot. If you're just eyeballing this stuff in camera, trying to get good exposure with log, you can definitely do it, and that's how I shoot a lot of stuff, but you're also going to be in a situation where it's maybe not exactly the right exposure for what the LUT is expecting, so you can come in here and on your basic correction, we can play around with the exposure and just bump it up a little bit and kind of see where we push it to the limit, and obviously that's way too much. So finding a nice balance on that input. That's why I put the LUT on the creative tab rather than under the basic input LUT, just so that it's separated from kind of the exposure and all those initial tools. So I can go in here and just dial this up or down depending on what it looks like. Now, again, I'm running OBS for the live stream. I'm doing Premiere. Also, I tried to shoot as much of this 10-bit as possible. So unless the codec didn't allow it and it had to be 8-bit, which I don't think any of them on the S1H limit you to just 8-bit, I shot everything 10-bit. 4K all I, 422 whenever possible. 6K is 10-bit, but it's 420 and it's not all I. However, every codec I tried to use the optimal version for what I would use on an actual shoot in regards to color grading. So not the fastest stuff to load into Premiere, nor is it smooth playback, nor is it smooth while you're live streaming and your computer's bogged down with a lot of stuff. If you have a really nice high-end PC, maybe it playback a little bit better, but with a standard MacBook Pro, it chugs a little bit. So use your imagination. We're not going to be able to do proper playback. So this was, like I said, an autofocus test. Seemed to do pretty good. Everyone always talks about how Panasonic and the GH5 and the S1H, the autofocus is terrible, yada, yada, yada. That is not true. It's not terrible. It just maybe isn't as good as some other cameras Canon and Sony have noticeably better autofocus because of the technology they're using, but Panasonic isn't by any means terrible. It does work, and it does do face, eye tracking, animal tracking, etc. It's just not always perfect in motion. And that's the thing too that kind of keep in mind, that autofocus, even for photography, doesn't always nail it. You can do a series of shots for photography, and one or two might be out. It's not always this foolproof thing. And with video, a constant stream of images, needing to rely on perfect autofocus for every single one in sequence is a challenge that most cameras struggle with. This technology has improved a lot over the past couple years, and it's always getting better, so I'm excited for the future. But just keep that in mind when you're weighing autofocus. You know, even the best cameras can still make mistakes, and if it's a situation where you have the ability to control it with a human and they can make the determination on what's in focus and what's out, that's usually going to be better than relying on kind of the software, firmware side of things to interpret what's in focus and what you want in focus and which eye you want in focus, and hopefully, cross your fingers, it works perfectly and flawlessly on maybe a take that you can't repeat. So if you can't, I don't want to say don't trust it, because the autofocus systems are really good, and it is nice on the S1H that it's there and it works decently well. Like, as you can see, all this is autofocus. And again, I'm not doing anything crazy. I'm not, you know, waving the camera around or running around or doing anything like that. But as you get closer and further away, you can see that it kind of, it does have moments where it comes in and out, but in general, throughout. And of course, I apologize. This would be better with proper playback, but like I said, not always possible. So see, it lost me there, and then it comes back in. So just something to keep in mind. That was kind of an autofocus test. I did a few more later, but we're gonna get into more of like the color side of things. So again, I bumped that exposure up. Let's bring it back down to how it was shot. And you can see as shot with Vlog. The S1H is proper Vlog. It's not Vlog L, Vlog Lite like it is on the GH5 that we'll get to in a moment. But that's just a color test. This is my son Clark sitting in his car seat on a drive. We'll get to some nicer looking footage, but you know, I always like to throw in skin tones whenever possible, and this is not ideal light. It's in a car through the window, a lot of, you know, color cast and whatnot. So you got to kind of get a sense of, if you were just going to shoot home movies with the S1H, which is definitely not what it's for, but if you were, it might look something like this. Again, you could color tweak it however you like. This is just the out of the box aggressive LUT from Panasonic. Now let's get into some actual comparisons between GH5 and the S1H as my computer decides to play catch up with the processing. So on this layer right here, this is the GH5 footage. I can toggle that off, and the S1H footage is on this bottom layer. Immediately, you should be able to notice the depth of field distance difference. Here, I can even pull this up full screen if it'll allow me. Let's go, wake up. Maybe it doesn't want to do that right now. The GH5, in comparison, much deeper depth of field. So less bokeh, less of a blurry background, because I'm matching settings with the GH5 and the S1H for these tests as much as possible. You can see the color is slightly different. I'm using Cinelike V, although S1H has a Cinelike V2 profile, so it's a little bit different. And you can kind of even tell that just in the way the color renders. The greens are a little bit different. But this should give you a good idea, kind of for the focal length equivalence at the same aperture value, what you're looking at between the two. I really want to make this full screen here. There we go. And you can kind of see the S1H. And again with the GH5. I'm going to pop back over into the chat just to see if there's any questions. Please turn the mouse to the on position for PC. We'll make video better. I will do that next time, I suppose. It's just kind of tough the way I have OBS set up between all the different scenes and whatnot. But I apologize if you can't see my mouse. I'll try and do a little bit better about showing that, at least what I'm selecting. So moving on to this next clip, when my computer catches up. Again, this 10-bit footage, 8-bit footage from the GH5 edits great. If you do have an older computer, maybe you'll have problems with it, but 4K 8-bit on the GH5 is no problem. It's when you get to 10-bit that things really start to chug. You can't even preview them on a MacBook Pro with QuickTime. You have to open them with VLC or directly in Premiere. Even importing in Premiere takes longer with 10-bit files. So just something to keep in mind if you're evaluating the difference between 10-bit and 8-bit and just kind of determining what you actually need, because there are certain situations where you may not actually need, and I'm looking at OBS right now and it's really not catching up right now to my talking. So I hope this is working. It might just be too much for the computer, honestly. Let's see. Hopefully, please let me know if you can see or if things are broken, but it does look like the camera is frozen for me in OBS, which is really irritating. Let me pop it off and pop it back on, see if it wakes back up. Nope. All right. There, that triggered it again. Hopefully you weren't looking at a frozen face, or you could at least hear. In any case, the 10-bit, 8-bit difference. 8-bit, if you're shooting color mostly accurate in camera, so kind of close enough to the final look, 8-bit should do you just fine. It's really when you're shooting in the log profiles or you're going to be doing heavy color grading in post that you may want 10-bit. It's going to give you more flexibility, but it is going to be harder for your machine to process, most likely, unless you have a incredibly fast PC that can just handle a bunch of data processing. So in general, know that there are times when you can shoot 8-bit and it can be just fine if you aren't doing a lot of color grading in post. You don't always have to shoot 10-bit just because it's technically better than 8-bit. Everything gets finalized to 8-bit anyway. So if you are worried about it and you feel like your footage is going to be inferior for some reason, you can kind of don't sweat it. People have been shooting 8-bit for a long time. It's just when you get in the situation of trying to grade log footage and you have 8-bits to work with. That's when it's tough. If you're not doing that, you're shooting color in camera and everything looks great as it's shot on set and you're only going to do mild tweaks, you can do 8-bit and it'll do a decent enough job. So yeah, the screen is pretty lag severe. Just a pic of you, all better, working for now. Fingers crossed. Premiere with the 10-bit footage is known not to be great. I'm going to try and hopefully we'll get through it. Here's another shot. Again, I'm just filming around outside. Some stuff with some decent dynamic range, but it's not, crazy like interior to exterior kind of business, but you can get a sense. This is the GH5, Cinelec V, and if I turn that off, toggle it off, that's the S1H equivalent. I do have all the specs recorded audio-wise, so at some point I might put together a video saying exactly what the difference is. If I recall, this is around like F4 or 5.6, if I'm remembering correctly. Moving on to this next clip, because once we get into the log stuff, I think it gets a little bit more interesting in terms of the comparison between the two. Hopefully this wakes up here in a second. This shot, Cinelec V2, this is the S1H, and then if I toggle the GH5, there you go. And again, you should be noticing the difference in the depth of field. If I pull this up full frame, you can see the GH5, it's got a deeper depth of field for the same aperture equivalent. It's just the nature of a smaller sensor and the way that you shoot to get kind of the same shot. In comparison, if you look at the S1H, obviously much shallower depth of field, and some people think that's cinematic. Other people complain about the depth of field being too shallow. I think it's really determined by the shot and what's in frame and what you want the shot to be. For this, I think I do prefer the S1H for this particular shot, but it's also like I don't hate the GH5. Just it's the nature of full frame versus micro four third, but I'm sure everybody kind of already knows that. When we look at this next shot, this is where things started to get interesting for me. So it's the exact same shot. Once it pops up here in a second, it's the exact same shot, but it was shot log. So vlog L on the GH5 and vlog on the S1H. This is the S1H here, and when I turn the aggressive LUT on, you can see very, very dark, but that can obviously be adjusted because I'm pulling the exposure down. As shot, this LUT blows out a lot of those highlights. So if you pull the exposure down, you could do some grading, pull the shadows back up. In fact, we could even do that right here, and kind of even out things and make it balanced and contrast either way we want, like preserving those highlights. However, in comparison, so that's back to 0 exposure. In comparison, the GH5 though, when I do that same kind of maneuver, so obviously too bright, if I pull the exposure down, here we have that situation where Vlog L has those kind of clipped highlights, and you know, it's not quite as pleasing. So that might not be the way to go about that one. Even if I try and pull these highlights back in, there are some there, but the roll off in those highlights to me is just not as nice. If you take a look at this is GH5, and if we pull the S1H back up here, I just think the smooth, the gradient in those highlights is a lot nicer on the S1H, as it should be. It should have more dynamic range, and this is a situation where it presented itself for this particular shot. So again, I'm using these adjustment layers, so I'm applying the exact same color to both the GH5 and the S1H because they were shot identical in terms of exposure and as close to composition as possible. So I did another one here, same kind of thing, and it just goes to show you that the S1H is giving you a little bit more dynamic range compared to the GH5. I'm going to mute all these audio tracks just so we don't have any weird hiccups. And it's that's how it should be. The S1H is a more expensive camera. The thing is the OBS going to crash again? Yeah. This is really fun to have to fix this every 2 seconds, refresh the camera. This isn't to say that the GH5 is as good as the S1H. Different cameras, different price point, different date in which they came out. The S1H should be better overall. Most of my tests kind of confirm that as we look through this footage. There's nothing radical here in terms of saying the S1H is better than the GH5. It is better than the GH5. Visually, it makes sense. It's a more expensive camera. It's better built. It's newer. However, the question is how much better? Is it significantly better from the GH5 to where it makes sense if you already have a GH5 or a GH5S that you need to then upgrade to the S1H because of some perceived benefit it's going to give you? That is to be debated, and what I'm still debating currently, going through this footage, a lot of this stuff when we get to it, it'll be my first time even looking at it because this is stuff I shot today and yesterday. I'm just pulling it into Premiere now. As we look through this stuff, know that that's how I'm approaching it. I'm looking at this not going like, oh wow, the S1H is better. That's amazing. Obviously, it should be. If the S1H were worse in any way, visually, it would be a terrible investment. It's just trying to grade how much of a difference. Is it a meaningful difference, or is it, okay, I could work around that with a cheaper camera that I already have. Maybe you already have a GH5 or GH5S, and you don't necessarily need or feel the obligation to, oh, I have to have the full frame one because of what? What could that possibly be? And we'll keep looking through it to see if there is anything that stands out. I'm gonna check the chat real quick just in case anything's a problem, because I know this is maybe not quite an optimal stream just because of the nature of all the stuff that's going on. So apologies for any technical difficulties. Let's see. Enjoy your channel. Great content. I wish I shoot with the S1 and want to get the S1H as my main camera. Hopefully it will be a price drop. I haven't worked with the 8-bit since I dropped Sony cameras because that was the whole point of going to the GH5. For sure, if you need 10-bit and you want that flexibility, by all means. If you're shooting with a profile that's pretty close to how you're going to finalize, that's how I would recommend on the older Sony cameras if you're waiting for the A7S III, which obviously has 10-bit now. The older ones, it's like, don't frustrate yourself by shooting log and then having compromised footage in post-production. Shoot closer to what you want on set in camera because you're limited by the 8 bits. Popping back over to Premiere, we'll move on. Moving right along. Now we're starting to get into some of the stuff that's a little bit, I was just starting to piece this stuff together. So this is not any kind of Diet Coke commercial. I just thought it was a fun little shot I could get in my kitchen and kind of set these two cameras side by side. And in this situation, so I've got the color on there. This is how it was shot, so definitely underexposed. So bringing it up by like, 1.5, there we go. We get some nice vibrant colors there. I had some LED RGB lights in the background for the red just to match the can, and that is the GH5 right there. Comparatively to the S1H, they are, let me pull that, that's a little hot on the, there we go. Let me go like that. Let's pull the highlights down, potentially just a little bit. I don't know, we'll play around with it. But comparatively, the S1H and the GH5 in this situation, the difference is very, very minimal. You could argue over the highlights maybe a little bit, but again, this isn't something like professionally lit. It's just me setting up a little scene in my kitchen. So I did have a light, but to really, maximize this type of shooting, you can do it with almost any camera if you're going to spend the time lighting it properly. The nice thing about this was that how close Vlog and Vlog L are to each other. You might have a little bit more saturation from the GH5, but for the most part, I'm not seeing anything here that's radically different. So this is the GH5 full screen, and I'm sure that on the stream it's not anything spectacular because we have YouTube compression and all that stuff, but this should hopefully give you kind of an idea. And then back to the S1H, and of course it's going to do that because I always do that when I'm in the timeline, so make that full screen. Now here's something that's interesting that I mentioned on my kind of first impressions after the first day with the S1H. The S1H, you probably maybe have a hard time seeing this on YouTube, but just hopefully take my word for it. I'm shooting with a light here. The ISO on these cameras is basically as low as it can go for log mode. The S1H doesn't have very much of what I call on the GH5 like texture in the image, where if I pop back here to the GH5, there is like a noticeable grain pattern. I don't know that I would call it noise because it's not a noisy shot. There is light here, and it's not just in the shadows, it's in the red here. And again, I apologize if you can't see this on YouTube, but hopefully you can tell what I'm talking about when I zoom in here to 400%. So see, you have like this grain texture like pattern on the GH5 footage. This has been something that's, been there since the GH4, right? It's noise, grain, I don't know what you want to call it, but it's there. Whereas if I bounce out of here and I go over to the S1H and we do kind of the same maneuver where we punch in to 400%, hopefully you can see that this is like a lot cleaner. There is some, digital compression type stuff going on, but it's softer, I would say. It's not as noticeable. And in here overall, it just has like a cleaner, smoother look. I'm shooting Vlog, which, and the noise reduction, all this stuff is set as low as it can go on both cameras. So I'm not reducing noise or doing anything like that. It's basically shooting stock standard log on each of these cameras. And you can just see the difference in that kind of cleanliness to the signal. This isn't like low light. This isn't a situation where I'm bumping the ISO all the way to 6400 or anything like that. It's purely a situation of the way the signal is encoded. Bit rate can be part of that, but again, I'm recording as high a bit rate, like I'm maxing out the codecs on each of these cameras. 10-bit, 422, all I, like throwing as much at this footage as possible to truly get that, paint that picture again of what each camera can do at maximum horsepower. And you can see there's a lot more of that kind of grain or texture. Now, at the end of the day, is it a problem? No, because this is 4K. A lot of people are gonna scale it down to 1080, and even from there, they're gonna export and upload to YouTube or Vimeo or something like that. A lot of that gets hidden in translation, in compression, in export. So in both cases, you're probably going to be delivering in, and what you're acquiring is not going to match perfectly what your final export is. However, if you are concerned about having the highest quality input, this is a scenario where the S1H does a noticeably better job than the GH5. And I did another shot with a slightly different exposure for the same setup. And we'll have to wait for that to trigger a little bit. And you can even see the light here in frame. This is it's the Aperture 300D Mark II with a softbox on there. So this is let's go pull this up full size. Make sure I'm looking at the right thing. So this is GH5, and you can see same kind of deal we were looking at before. This one was overexposed slightly, so the difference in the shots, if you look at, if I just turn the color off, you can see that's the GH5 how it was shot for the first one, and then that's how it was for the first shot. I played around with exposure a little bit because there's always that debate of, do you overexpose, do you underexpose, do you shoot it spot on every single time? I think it definitely depends, again, on the scene and the environment. But for this, I looked at it and I was like, that's kind of dark. Let me brighten it up just a little bit. But you saw, and again, this because the lighting was not optimized perfectly for this setup, that some of the foam and stuff was overexposed with this stock LUT, but it is there. You can see the GH5 is capturing it. We have detail there, and you can play around with the color to your heart's desire. Even on the can, some of those highlights that look like they're gone with the LUT come right back with log. So really, that is the joy of log, and also the downfall that you have to spend time perfecting it, because you can't just throw a LUT on there and say, hey, it's done, it looks beautiful. You might be throwing away valuable detail that you want to save, or maybe you don't. It just depends on the kind of artistic stylings. But in both cases, the GH5 and the S1H, which will pop up here hopefully in a second as I kind of scrub through, they're capturing the full dynamic range, and then it's being obliterated by this LUT, which is the aggressive LUT. There are many, many more that you can play around with. This is the most contrasty, aggressive one, as the name implies, so it's not always going to do the best job. But in general, you can kind of get a sense of like what the image is kind of supposed to look like. So we can even scroll over here, look at skin tones, see all the highlights on my hand just disappear with the LUT, whereas they are there to begin with. So I did another shot here. Let's back this out and kind of fit it to the frame. So we can see, again, what that color's doing, and that's just a 0.5 exposure increase, which for me, that 0.5 is kind of where I would want that, the cola in the glass there, and playing around with it. This is the S1H right there, and then turning on the GH5 layer, you have that there. Again, very, very matchy-matchy. To me, it's just about that difference in the kind of grain structure, where when you look at, that's the GH5, and that's the S1H. Hopefully you can see the noticeable difference, even on YouTube. I'm hoping you can see just the softness of the texture compared to the GH5, which just has that kind of crispier, crunchier noise, I guess. That's GH5, S1H. You can see kind of same spot. I'm gonna pop over in the chat. Hopefully that's translating on YouTube. If it's not, just let me know. The S series is way cleaner than my GH5. Both were. My S1 has way less chroma noise at 115 megabits per second than my GH5 did, even in the all-I bit rates. So that's exactly what I'm showing right now. I have my camera frozen. Yep, it's frozen. Apologies, got to fix it real quick. That's a silly, really annoying little bug. I don't know why it does that. I don't know why switching into Premiere causes my video to freak out. But in any case, I don't want to be a frozen frame. Let's see. So saying cleaner, yes. from these tests, and I'm just recording right out of the box. You know, I'm not doing any noise reduction. There's nothing, no trickery going on here. I'm recording at maximum quality on both the GH5 and the S1H, and the S1H just has that kind of cleaner image right out the gate, which is great to see. Could you do some processing to get rid of it? Does it ultimately not matter because you're going to go compress it for web anyway? Maybe, maybe, maybe. It depends on the project, but it's definitely, I think, something that immediately I noticed just looking at the S1H footage on the first shoot. I opened the stuff up, even in the 8-bit mode, playing a clip back in Finder and just going, wow, that's so clean. It's just smooth compared to GH4 and GH5. As much as I love them, there's always that little bit of a texture, right? That little bit of noise or grain or whatever you want to call it. It's there, even with the cleanest image, perfectly exposed, lowest ISO, it's still there. And that's why I call it like texture. You could call it noise, whatever you prefer, but it's always there. It's inevitable. And you can look at it and go, oh, it's not ugly. Most people don't even notice, but it is there. These comparisons are actually super helpful, especially since I'm debating between the GH5 and the regular S1. Excellent. I'm glad this is helpful. I always overexpose 1 1/3 stop on Sony because with the S-curve and data retention was pushed to the high end with only 8 bits. That was the compromise. On the GH5 and the S1H, I've always done correct exposure. There's more than enough bit depth to allow it. You're back in the video stills mode. Hopefully it's working again. Thank you for letting me know. I'll try and make that adjustment on the fly. I just have to reset the video input anytime I'm bouncing back and forth. In fact, I don't know, maybe I should spend the time doing it right now, but I could theoretically just have my face in the Premiere mode, but I think that'll be clunky to do in OBS. So I might just stay in Premiere, but if I'm in Premiere, I'm full screen and I can't really see what's going on in the chat. So again, apologize for all the technical difficulty type stuff. So let's pull this up here and keep moving on. Premiere's going to take its sweet time, thinking about what's going to happen next. I do think it's funny. It seems to do... Oh, here we go. So there's the original shot on the S1H, and even over here with the GH5 footage. So this is kind of where I left off, and you can see kind of how I was recording this stuff. Just shot for shot, basically mounted both cameras to the same tripod, had lens equivalents, so not the same focal length on the GH5 and the S1H, but the focal equivalents on each camera. It was an 85 on the S1H and a 42.5 on the GH5. And you can see here, as shot, there's the S1H, and then here the GH5 should pop up. That's actually the next shot. I think I'm behind a shot here. Yeah, I was right about to drop that one in. So that lines up there. And maybe even the, let's wait for it to think its way through. And pop the LUT on here. It's probably got some exposure business going on. Yep, it certainly does. Let's bring that back down. Obviously under. So bringing it up. Again, this aggressive one may not be the best. Maybe let's pull in a new LUT here. I'm gonna browse for it. They have a nicest LUT, which is less aggressive, and it's pretty nice. So you can see we've got the nicest. That's what it's called over on the site from Panasonic for Vericam. The nicest LUT. Anyway, GH5, and that's the S1H. You can see there's a little bit of color difference on this shot. I don't know if that's a lens issue or a camera issue. This was shot exact same time simultaneously with nothing different from the previous setup. So it is interesting to notice how much better the GH5 looks color-wise, but you could easily fix that on the S1H. And this one I wanted to kind of do to see those the highlights on these kind of sphere orb. This is from a little decorative basket we have in the house. One of the things my wife likes to set up, just nice little decor around the house. I pulled all the balls out and I threw them on the table just as something to film. And I wanted to look at those specular on the spheres, because I think that's something interesting where you can kind of look and analyze the difference in like the highlight roll off on a physical object sitting on a table. I've got the light pretty close. It's got a big soft dome on it, but you can see kind of the shadow pattern there and just what those speculars look like. And the GH5 and the S1H in this scenario look pretty close to identical. Is there some difference there in the log that we're not seeing represented when we put the LUT on there? Maybe, but in general, I think these look almost indistinguishable in terms of dynamic range. It's not the most dynamic range shot you could have, certainly, but it is something where, you know, you talk about roll off into the highlights, etc. Here's another test with just these three, and if I pull those off, you can again see kind of where I think we're actually, you're probably seeing, I can see it on this one. I bumped the brightness up on the light for this shot, and I intentionally overexposed this one. So you can see, let's go into 100% here, and let's even look first before the LUT, let's look right at it. So this is the GH5 that you're looking at right here, and I intentionally overexposed this for this particular test to see how much of the highlight information would be retained, specifically on this, the white sphere on the right, the ball, the sphere. It's not really a ball that you would like play catch with or anything. It's just decor. So that's why I think keep calling them spheres. But the right ball, you can see how much more detail is being captured by the S1H when they're equally overexposed. So that's the S1H, that's the GH5. Hopefully you can see the difference there in just the specular, how much more detail there is on the S1H. So again, noticeable increase in dynamic range. When we turn the LUT on, it should be even more noticeable, where we actually have detail on the S1H right there that gets lost on the GH5. That may or may not be important to you. As we've shown on previous shots, if the shot is properly lit, there should be mostly the same, right? Because if you don't have beyond the dynamic range that the camera is capable of, it should look the same on both. It's in those situations where you're pushing it to the limit and you're going beyond the dynamic range that the GH5 can capture, in this case, being severely overexposed. And then the S1H is actually able to save a lot more of that fall off. It still loses it in the brightest spot there. I can even pull this up full screen if that's helpful. But the shot, that's way too close. You notice that you got a lot more of that detail there. That's just gone on the GH5. So something to keep in mind. If you can fit all of the dynamic range of the shot, you know, with lighting and make sure everything's contained and there's nothing severely blowing out, you should be fine. This was some fun stuff we did with the family at the pool today. So this was just S1H. There's no way I was gonna capture, you know, two cameras, same time of kind of fast action. Again, home video kind of stuff, but you can hopefully get a sense of skin tones and whatnot. I did shoot all of this at 60 frames a second, just because, you know, splashing and whatnot is always fun in, you know, the water, and kind of the visuals of that. Let me make this a little bit bigger because we don't necessarily need all these other panels right now. I still have that nicest LUT on here. It should be. I just want to double check and make sure. Yeah, the nicest LUT, because it's still that same adjustment layer. So I really like how these skin tones look. Subjective, can be changed with color, but just something right out of the box, like, looks really nice. There's some certain shots that are not, you know, lit as well as others, but this is, you know, full sun. Let's see right here. Full sun, really nice light, and really nice color. The pool and water, everything looks great. Whereas if you look at the log mode, nice, even color. And let me check what I have my exposure set exactly spot on. So I was just filming on the fly, and apparently I exposed this properly for the way Vlog wants you to expose. So that's what that looks like, right? And then mapped with a LUT. Looks like that. Keep moving on. There's probably a few more shots in here that are worth taking a look at. Just really nice skin tones with this LUT from the way it was exposed. I was using an ND filter, variable ND on the lens, so you do have that. Yeah, this was all 60 frames, so you get some of that fun splashing. Again, not going to be doing playback just because of the limitations of this computer with the stream, but you can kind of see, oh, this is a fun shot. So this is again the benefit of having a full frame camera. You can get close to the wide angle lens and have a relatively shallow depth of field, or at least a blurry background, which is very hard to replicate on a smaller sensor camera like the GH5. Yes, you can do wide angle, but will the depth of field be as shallow? Perceptibly, no, it won't. You'll have more visually in focus than not, but that's why I like the full frame look. It's the benefit of shooting full frame, having those wide shots really close with that shallow depth of field. However, full frame struggles when you're doing more telephoto stuff, right? It's easier to get further shots on a crop sensor. So there's pros and cons either way to a bigger sensor or a smaller sensor. It really is up to what your priorities are. If you like the wide angle look though, with the shallow depth of field, definitely a full frame camera is gonna have its benefits. And the boys were just having a fun time jumping in the pool. Looks like that one's a little bit underexposed. And family just hanging out. Some splash stuff. I think if I'm remembering correctly, this is where, yeah, I was just trying to get like a nice like sun in the right spot, the sun being a nice edge for these skin tones, and again looks really nicely exposed. Get that really nice beautiful bokeh. This was shot with the 24-70. This is the Lumix Pro lens, the 24-70 2.8. I believe I was shooting this at f4 outside, and just really nice skin tones, beautiful highlights, nice bokeh. Just a nice shot if you're doing some kind of like diving sequence. This is my son Clark again. The green on his face, he's standing in the grass, so you get that inevitable color cast. Not ideal, right? For filming, you know, you don't want colors close to your subject. It's gonna like pollute the image a little bit. So here we have some more just foliage, green, nice plants outside. Nothing too special about this. It's just was there, so I decided to film it. Get some kind of close-up shots. Those are grapefruit. They're not yellow yet. They still need to ripen. And continuing on, I'm just seeing if there's anything interesting here that's worth noting. I don't think. Here you get some like fun, you know, ultra wide. Well, ultra wide. I mean, 24 on a full frame is pretty wide, and so I was doing some fun shots of the tree here. This tree is massive, which is not something very common here in Phoenix, Arizona. It's not always often you get to see nice big trees. So maybe a nice little delight for me, but maybe where you're at, there's plenty of big trees. This was me cooking some lunch. I set up a light in the kitchen, so I wanted to get some like food beauty shots, cooking up a little meat and egg dish. Again, nothing too incredible to talk about here other than just, you know, color, dynamic range, and it looks like I stopped down there a little bit. So we'll just keep going through this. Test footage. Looks nice. I mean, for food, I'd eat it. I did eat it. It was delicious. Threw some eggs in there and made myself a nice burrito. So sprinkled some cheese on, threw some sauce on, Taco Bell hot sauce. Delicious, delicious, delicious. Nothing too spectacular here. I think it looks nice, but I'm gonna keep moving on to some more interesting shots. Here's outside again. Went outside and did some desert stuff. Oddly enough, this was a fun chance to sort of test the overheating, if there is any on the S1H. And before we get to that, I just want to pop over the chat, make sure I'm not missing anything. But before I do that, I probably have to, hey, it didn't freeze that time. It still is, still looking good. Hopefully it looks and sounds good. You want me to make some of these available for download, especially the S1H? Yeah, I can let you download some of the raw files. just exposed correctly, no exposed to the right. I really like the blues on the S1H. Yeah, yeah, and that was the nicest LUT. It's gonna be different. There's different LUTs. There's like rose, warm gold, like winter. Like they you know, I like the LUTs that are just kind of normal, and then doing any kind of like crazy creative color grading later on, not built into the LUT. I think that causes a lot of problems in workflow. On the GH5 and the S1H, I've always done correct exposure. Yeah, and that's what, if you're going to be using the Varicam LUTs, make sure that your exposure is spot on, because that's what the LUTs are meant for. They're meant for proper exposure. So anyway, outdoor here, again, this is Arizona. I think it was probably 110 degrees today. I don't know exactly what it was, but it was hot. And I recently did a GH5 overheating test, just mostly for fun. It wasn't anything too scientific. Just because it's come up with the A7S III, does that overheat? The Canon R5 and R6, obviously, those overheat. The S1H has fans built into it. Panasonic had the foresight, at least, to know that overheating could be a problem on the S1H, so they put fans in there compared to the S1 and the S1R. The S1H, one of the main things about it is that it has fans because it's doing some more high-end video processing. I did not have the camera overheat on me today while I was doing this stuff, and it was very hot. Direct sun, out in the middle of the desert. This is definitely not a fun environment to be filming in, just as a human being, let alone the camera. The camera became physically so hot that it was hard for me to touch it and hold it. It was like, I don't want to say burning my hand, but close. It's a black camera baking in the sun. It was hurting my hand. It was so hot, and the camera didn't falter. It kept rolling, no overheating warnings. It didn't power off. The only issue I had was a card writing issue where like one clip errored out because it said the card wasn't fast enough for the shot. Could have been just a fluke, whatever. But again, I'm using the highest quality codecs I can on these, so depending on your SD card and how you're recording, that would adjust. You can see here, if you'll notice, some of these clips are marked as yellow with the FX. That's just because they've been scaled to frame. These are shot at 6K, not 4K. So later on, I'll probably go through, you know, a more like pixel peeping kind of look. But if you just want, for example, to look at, this is a 4K sequence, by the way. I don't know if I said that before, but so this is a 6K shot and a 4K sequence. So you can see the difference. I mean, 6K is significantly bigger than 4K. Is it as much as 8K? No. Is it as much as 12K? No. But 6K isn't a mild, 5% on either side. It's significant. So when you scale this down and you set it to frame size, you're going to be looking at basically 65% is the scale. So you're scaling it down. What is that? 35%, if that's how the percentages work in Premiere, which is I'm pretty sure that's how they work. So, that's 50% of 6K, so 65 or 66, which is roughly, 33% more or something like that. So just keep that in mind. When you see 6K, it may not seem like a lot compared to 4K as far as, 6K, I don't really need it. There may be situations where you actually do, if you know the difference between the two. 4K is a beautiful format to finalize in. Almost all of my videos I export at 4K, even if some of it was shot at 1080. But that's why I want to get a camera that can basically do everything I want at 4K or higher, rather than the GH5, where for the slow motion, high frame rate stuff, you're limited. You can do 4K 60, which I do often, but if you want to do 120, you gotta drop down to 1080p. So just getting some shots of some cactus here. Keep clipping through. There's some shots later that I kind of really liked, but I like how this is looking. It's nice. This lens is not the sharpest lens, the 24-70. Here again, I was doing some autofocus kind of stuff to just see what the camera could do and what it could keep up with me walking out there. And again, to look at skin tones. I'm obviously a little bit red just because it's very warm outside, but my cheeks tend to be a little bit red anyway, as is. So autofocus is keeping up. Is it perfect? Is it flawless? No. But is it awful and unusable? No. If you're not doing anything crazy, It should do a decent job of keeping you in focus. However, sometimes it may if you're moving around too much. And I found there is about a kind of a sweet spot for autofocus, which is about this orientation, maybe a little bit closer. If you get further away, it has a hard time seeing faces. And if you get too close, it obviously doesn't recognize the face. So just something to keep in mind. I believe this next shot, at some point I switched to Cinelec V again. I don't know if it's this next one. No, this is, I just filmed with a wider focal length. Again, testing autofocus. So this is at 24 and that last one was at 70. Moving right along. Not optimal time to be filming where the sun was, although it's not straight overhead. So just trying to use the sun as a nice edge light to kind of get some variety. Of course, you could color correct this however you like. If I take the LUT off, you can see log. Looks like there's no color. And if we play around with the LUT that's on there, maybe pull that other aggressive one in, you can kind of see the variety and the flexibility. We can even have fun with some of the, there's one called Golden. That's very, very aggressive for a LUT, and probably something I wouldn't do with a LUT unless I knew that's exactly what I wanted it to look like. But I would probably do this on my own with curves or something. I wouldn't process it, you know, as base just to get there. Now, one thing that maybe I will mention, and I'm going to switch this back to the nicest LUT. Not my opinion. I don't think it's the nicest LUT. It's just what the name is called. One thing I will note about the S1H here, the Ursa Mini Pro film mode, I really like the way it responds to these kind of baseline corrections you can put in here. So like typically on the Ursa Mini Pro, shooting in film mode, I'll do something like shadows down -100, highlights up to positive, you know, plus 100, and then, you know, just to add contrast without, you know, severe manipulation. But on the S1H, you have to push it even more. So you can pull the blacks down, whites down, up, and that's definitely probably too much. Maybe something like there. You can even, you know, crazy contrast. And just in general, the log is kind of green to begin with. All of that's corrected with the built-in LUTs, or not the built-in, but the ones for Panasonic. But if you're just trying to color correct V-Log on its own, that's what this kind of process would look like. So you'd be going through here, maybe you're pulling the exposure down a little bit, maybe not even that much. And then I would, you know, probably pop over to proper my color panel with my full waveforms here. And I'd probably pull a curve on here, pull some of that green out. And this is the tedious process of if you want to color this without a LUT, right? You're going to go through all these steps to try and get it tuned the way you want, which can be a chore depending on how fast your computer is and how good at color grading you are. Let's see, let's bump the saturation up. So you can kind of see the path to getting somewhere that you like. Although I will say about the S1H, this doesn't grade the same way that there's a Mini Pro grades, and I've gotten really used to the ease in which the Ursa Mini footage just grades so nicely without any kind of LUT. Just the standard Lumetri effects with curves and whatnot, you can get a really, really nice look, where the S1H so far, I probably just have to get used to it, but it doesn't react the same way to some of these adjustments. So that can slow down your process if you're used to something different. In this case, I don't like how that looks at all. So I'm gonna reset everything and just go back to putting one of those Panasonic LUTs on here. We could go with the aggressive one, or let's go back to the nicest one. And probably bump that exposure up, maybe just a little bit, I don't know. Moving right along, clicking through the footage here. This is where I switched to Cinelec V, if you couldn't tell. So we need to turn the LUT off. And I just wanted to see, you know, that difference between V-Log and Cinelike V in camera. There's plenty of picture profiles to choose from on the S1H, so really it's kind of pick whichever one you like and how it looks and then dial it in. There's even more customization options than there are on the GH5. On the S1H, you can dial in even by like 0.5. So on the GH5, I've got very used to V-Log, Cinelike V, and then dialing it down like -1, -2, -3 in certain situations on contrast, on saturation, on noise reduction and sharpness for Cinelike V. You can turn all those up or down. This time it was really struggling to find focus. I wonder why. I wonder what I was doing. I wonder if I was moving around a lot. On the S1H though, you can, even for like Cinelike V, and technically it's Cinelike V2 on the S1H, you can dial those by like 0.5 increments. So you can do -0.5, -1, -1.5, and so on. So you really have a lot more fine tuning of each of those picture profiles on the S1H than you do on the GH5, which is something I haven't heard anyone talk about or mention in any of the reviews I've watched. It's a minor, mild little thing, but it could be helpful in a situation where you're like really trying to get it all set and good on set, and you just really want to dial in and, you know, like 0.5 more or 0.5 less. Just a little option there. Going through this, I like some of these shots here towards the end. This was the reverse shot, so full sun rather than using the sun as the edge. I'm using it as a key just to see how that reacted. And because the sun is in such a bad spot, I'm trying to like lift my face up so I don't have, you know, raccoon eyes from the shadows there. So you can see, you know, that is probably overexposed there just a little bit. We'll dial that down. And hopefully, oh, I'm not even, that layer's not even on. It's Cinelike V, that's right. So theoretically, we could come in here and throw a Lumetri color on and drop that exposure. But that's not how I would want that to look in this case. You could theoretically pull these highlights down, maybe. They are there, it looks like, except for maybe, no, it looks like it did a pretty good job saving all the skin tone there, even though it was me looking directly at the sun. So if that's how you like to shoot, you can get a kind of interpretation of what that would look like right here with the skin tone. And again, I'm doing autofocus because I'm by myself in the desert out there, so it's not like, there, I'm really looking up, straight into the sun, like the aliens are coming to take me or something. But yeah, depending on how you shoot, what you like, there's definitely situations where full sun as the key looks really nice. Other times the sun is better as an edge. Usually I find myself using it as an edge, but it just depends. This is still Cinelike V as we go through here. I believe, you know, it's the S1H is doing a pretty good job keeping me in focus with the kind of full face composition here. Looks like it lost me there for a second as I'm moving around. But if you want to use the camera in that kind of like stand in front of the camera, look at it, don't move around too much, I probably would trust the autofocus on the S1H. I'd have to do a little bit more testing, but it's in those situations where you're moving a lot, you're popping in and out of frame, you're following action, you're getting farther away or too close. If you kind of want to like set a shot up, or in fact what you could do, if you didn't want the tracking feature of the autofocus, you could just use the smartphone app, pair it to the camera, that way you get kind of a live view on your phone, and you can just autofocus directly from the app, which is another great way to do it if you're kind of shooting all by yourself and you want, you know, to have a longer focal length, and so you're far away from the camera, you can't reach it, you can't adjust anything, you can't make sure it's in focus. So I definitely recommend that, and it's nice that it's there as a feature, so you can get some long lens selfie shots. More stuff just in the desert. Still Cinelike V. Going through here. So here's where I started playing around with it again. So this is Cinelike V. This next shot should show more of the benefits of V-Log if it catches up here in a second. This one. So that's Cinelike V. let that soak in for a second. And then let's take a look at the next shot, which should be log. There it is. Kick on the LUT, and let's see what that does. So that kind of, I don't want to say soft, but there is a softness to the image while still being, still in contrast, that I find pleasing compared to Cinelike V. That's, too much. But that's Cinelike V. It looks very hot, very contrasty, very video, where shooting log and then applying the LUT, I think looks much nicer in this scenario. Now, the LUT here is the nicest LUT, but I also did this with the aggressive LUT, and I thought it looked equally as nice. Just has a nice muted but rich tone. I don't know if that makes sense, compared to Cinelike V in the previous shot. Again, you could use a different profile, you could dial in a little bit better, but there's something about the way that the S1H captures log, and then with the right LUT in the right situation, I just kind of like how it turns out. It's got a nice little treatment there. Clicking over to the next shot, same deal. So there's the log shot. I mean, there's like very, very little contrast here at all. I mean, it basically looks like just a gray blob. But the moment you put the LUT on, and that's the aggressive LUT, the image just comes to life. Saturation, everything. It's got that nice, rich filmic quality to it that is very, very pleasing to my eye, at least. Moving on to the next shot. That's the Cinelike V equivalent. So it just has that, like, I don't know, punchier, more video. Like, to me, that is not a film. That's not a Western or any kind of desert stereotype. It's just looks like someone shot it, with a video camera. This shot, same thing, Cinelike V. So you kind of have this like nice little golden wheat or grass or weeds or whatever it is right here. And I mean, that looks nice, certainly. But the moment we flip the camera, the S1H into log mode, as it catches here. So log, pop the LUT on. That's beautiful. And that's the kind of color I like, at least to my eye, that kind of muted but rich. I think that looks very, very nice. I'm going to switch it over to the nicest LUT here just to see the variation there between the aggressive and the nicest. And then, I think this is a case where aggressive looks really nice. I think aggressive is nicer in this case. I personally prefer how this looks with the aggressive LUT here and how it looked with the nicest LUT. Check out this next shot. There's only 2 little clips left. This is again where my hand was just burning up filming some of this stuff because the camera was so hot. And again, no overheating issues or warnings. I'm sure it would at a certain point. Every camera has its breaking point, but my hand was having its breaking point before the camera was. And again, looks so nice. These little, I think these are like weeds. They're all dried out and dead, but just that nice, beautiful golden color. Very satisfying to look at, I think, especially with this aggressive LUT on there. I think it's nice. And a little friendly insect of some kind crawling his way on these. And that full frame shallow depth of field. I mean, the bokeh, it's the one thing if you've been shooting micro four third, or even a Super 35 or APS-C for that matter, it is harder to do. Not impossible. You can definitely match it. And there are many instances where, it works out. And sometimes it doesn't work out in your favor on full frame, to be totally honest. You don't always want the shallowest depth of field. Sometimes you want more in focus. But for some of this stuff, it can just look really, really nice, really smooth and rich. Especially I'll let you look at the log shots there. So that's the end of my footage so far. I have the camera for a couple more days, so I'm going to shoot some more stuff. Hopefully that's at least helpful. And I'm going to pop over to the chat here. Let's see, make sure my camera's not frozen. It is. I'm going to fix that real quick. Pop that, switch that. Fixing. All right. Let's see what's going on in the chat. My camera stays in vlog. The problem with vlog is that it looks like vlog because no one puts the hyphen in there. Just a minor little nitpick for Panasonic and their choice in name. It's good in correct light, bright light, and low light, and the corrected colors are great. I don't even touch the other profiles anymore. I agree. When I shot with the GH5 and GH5S, I only shot in vlog. Yeah. Let's see. Nice choice with the black clothing. Honestly, it's just a lightweight T-shirt I had on, so it's not like not to be smart and like avoid the sun. And when you live in Phoenix, you get used to it. So it's just like, okay, I need a shirt that's like lightweight and breathable compared to something else that's gonna like just soak up a bunch of sweat. It never fails to impress me how such a gray image can hold so much information. Yeah, that is the benefit there of 10-bit for sure. You have a lot of data to play with, and when you're saving those highlights, and if your shadows are clean, your exposure's good, it can turn out really, really nice. And a lot of that it comes down to the color grade and how it's processed. And I say definitely if you're struggling with color or footage, one of the best things to do is just play around with a bunch of different LUTs just so you can see what's possible. Because at the end of the day, a LUT is basically just a color preset. So just as I was switching around between some of these where like certain ones, like the nicest one I thought looked nice in some situations, but in other situations it's like the aggressive one or, this or that. Go through them all, see what's just possible with LUTs, and kind of get a sense of, okay, that theoretically all should be possible with your standard color grading tools. It's just one that's kind of like done, and as like a preset, you can just apply it and transform the footage in a radical way. Inevitably, every camera looks good when you take it from log to something with like a LUT or with a grade, just because the transformation is so drastic. You see those thumbnails on YouTube where it's, log on the left and then, oh my goodness, beautiful, saturated contrast image on the right. And you're like, this camera must be the best camera ever. And hopefully, as you've seen, I'm just going through clips that I randomly recorded. None of this is from, proper production. It's just me doing like little test stuff around the house and with the family and then going outside. You can see in certain situations, the camera looks great. In others, it looks like underwhelming and like home video. That is almost always the case because, like I've said before, it's not always about the camera. The camera can help you get there, but it's about more important things like lighting and what the scene is. Me filming me cooking my lunch looks a certain way, but if it was a proper kitchen studio and you had Gordon Ramsay there, it's gonna, even if you shot it with a GH5, that's gonna look better than me shooting me cooking my lunch with an S1H. So scene, context, actors, who's even giving the presentation, the lighting, how much time was put into it, right? I'm just cooking my lunch, pulling a camera up in a light and just filming what's happening. If you really dial things in on set and get the set beautiful, then the camera is just the tool that helps you capture what's already there in the best way possible, which I will say, I'll reiterate, the S1H is a better camera than the GH5. However, I will also say that just because it's better doesn't mean the GH5 is bad. Hopefully this shows you that the GH5 can stand up for the most part to the S1H. Really, I think of the S1H after my brief time using it so far, think of it more like a true cinema video camera. I don't actually like how it feels all that much. It's kind of big, it's kind of bulky. If taking photos, it does it, and I'm glad it does, because I always like having the ability to take photos if I'm going somewhere. But I had to start thinking of it more like, I don't know, like a Red Scarlet, from back in the day, or now it would be the Red Komodo, or maybe like the Z-Cam, or something that is like a proper filmmaking tool that definitely has the mindset you have to have for the S1H, because that's what it's built for. Where the GH5, in my mind, feels more like that true hybrid where it's not as much of a cinema camera as the S1H is. I don't know if that makes sense. It's just kind of the mindset for using it, the speed at which you use it. The S1H, to me, like, I haven't customized all the buttons because, again, this is a rental, and I'm probably not going to take the time to do that just because I only have it for a couple more days. You can make it faster to use by having a lot of the custom function buttons set up and dialed into the things you use all the time, but it's much more of that like slower paced. Maybe that sounds extreme. It's not super slow paced, but just that mindset of like, okay, this isn't like crazy run and gun as much as it is with the GH5, which is usually how I treat that camera because it's so lightweight, because it's so flexible. It's just like the S1H is kind of big and kind of bulky and a little bit clunky to use, but not in necessarily a bad way, just a different way. I don't know if that really makes sense or if I really have a point there, other than it's obviously a better video camera. And the more you treat it like a cinema camera, I think the happier you'll be with the resulting footage. Reading the chat here. You mentioned a few times you noticed the weight of the camera. Do you feel like that's something you'll get used to, or the GH5 is just better for you? Oddly enough, Trevor, as I just mentioned, it's almost like I can like predict it or something. The weight of the S1H I have not gotten used to. It is definitely a heavier camera than the GH5. The GH5 feels, and again, I don't have the biggest hands. My hands are pretty small. The GH5 feels about right, kind of that mid-size DSLR mirrorless style camera. Oftentimes when I shoot with the GH5, I'll put my pinky underneath as kind of like an additional support. So that way, like, I've got my index finger up here, I got my pinky under here, and then these two fingers just gripping it so I know it's not going anywhere. The S1H, it's a lot harder for me to do that because it's designed, like, fitting my pinky underneath the bottom base just doesn't work. So I've had to change the way I hold the camera. And then I feel a little bit like, maybe I can pop it off of here. Which, by the way, I don't know, I think I've mentioned this before. These tripods are the best, and one of the main reasons is because of the plate. It's just a little twist on, twist off, like, circle. But it's like the smartest, most ingenious thing. You don't need a tool, you don't need, like, anything. You just rotate it on, and then, of course, the camera can spin any which way on there. It's granted, it's a photography tripod, but I really, really like it if you're not doing any like movement where you would need a fluid head. If you just need a tripod. And then the other benefit being a photo tripod is, you can't even see it. Sorry, let me switch back to this other camera. Being a photo tripod with this plate, like it's got the pole, so you can just telescope up and down to set like the perfect height, which is what I hate about video tripods, is that you always have 3 legs, and anytime you want to raise it up or down, you got 3 legs to break and then lift it up, and then you always got to recenter it and level it with the ball head. On a photo tripod, just being able to telescope up and down, I mean, that maneuver of just raising the height or lowering the height, to me, happens much more often on set for the types of shoots that I do compared to like moving with a tripod head. A lot of times I think tripod movement looks a little cheap or like old school or just kind of like TV broadcast. I don't know, like pans and tilts and stuff just doesn't feel cinematic to me, so I very rarely do it. Oftentimes if there's any kind of movement, it would be like a gimbal or a slider or like a very specific like following the action, whereas like if you're just panning and tilting all the time, to me that's like, you know, news journalism 101, where like it's a, you know, you're at a building and there's a tilt down and reveal and it's a tilt up, and it's just like the cheapest, easiest move, and I feel like it has that feel. Anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent about the tripod. I just like photo tripods, specifically the slick one, because of the plate. Just being able to rotate the plate on and off is awesome, and then it clicks right in. Anyway, the weight of the S1H. So see my grip, I have to hold it this way. I can't, like putting my pinky under here puts like a weird pressure that I don't like. So I have to hold the grip, and then like it just feels, it's like right at the size of where if it were any bigger, I wouldn't want to hold it. Even like the hand grip on the Ursa Mini, like the side handle, I believe just from, you know, muscle memory and how it feels, is smaller than this grip. This grip feels really deep, really big, which if you have bigger hands maybe is a good thing, but it just feels oversized for me. And then the weight with the 24-70, which is obviously not a lightweight lens, you know, is significantly heavier than anything you'd have. Like the 12-35 equivalent on the GH5 is tiny in comparison. You miss out on the full frame benefits, but you do save in the weight department. And while a lot of times weight isn't a factor for video, because most of the time it is a tripod or it's on some kind of rig, or you want the weight just so that the movement is more, you know, subtle and isn't all jittery and shaky like it can be with a really light camera, it is noticeable. So if you were going to run around with this all day filming, I think you would get probably tired. Compared to the GH5, I can film on a GH5 all day, handheld, no problem, because it's just so lightweight and so easy to use. So I will say the fan did kick on the S1H when I was outside again in over, you know, probably 110, and it was baking in the sun. The fan was on, but very, very quiet. I mean, I had to put my ear up to it to even hear it, and even then it was just this kind of whisper. So the fan that's in there, or it might be a couple fans, I don't know if it's one or two or how it works, but it's not super noisy. So if that's a concern, your computer probably makes more noise than this camera does. I think cameras that have the potential to overheat should have fans in them. I'll leave it at that. Let's see, back in the chat. I did outfit mine with a tilted cage, which has the hand wrist pad attached and the handle on the left side. Ergonomically, it's much better. Let's see. GH5 seems more like digital 16mm and the S1H digital 35mm. Yeah, I mean, that's sure. You've dropped into video stills mode again. It looks like the OBS just caught up again. That's weird that it's doing that. Maybe I should close Premiere. How about I do that just to hopefully avoid that problem altogether. I'll save my project and bounce back to OBS. It's the inevitable problem with using the computer to do everything and not having stuff, you know, pre-rendered and exported and all that. I wanted to do kind of like a slow go through of all the footage, because I think that's what we all end up doing, right, in these test scenarios, is like explaining what I shot, why I shot it. It's one thing I see when I look at other people's stuff. It's like, okay, it might look nice, but like, why did you do it this way, or why was it set up that way? And of course, there's always all like the technical stuff in the corner, but even then can't really paint a full picture of like what exactly was happening, right? Like the shot of my son Clark, you know, standing and these little like faces like green tinted. It's like, well, he's standing on grass, so like don't even really look at that shot because it's terrible. And if I was going to cut a video, I probably wouldn't even put it in there. But then there's other stuff that I think is just, it's valuable to have context around like what you did and why you did it, especially in a situation like this where like none of that footage is particularly like all that great. But that can also be a fun way to test footage too, just to see if you can take the mundane and make it into something kind of special or magical just by like the camera or the color or the lighting or whatnot. So it's a fun exercise. And I think if you have the GH5 and you're worried about missing out on some special feature of the S1H, like don't. The S1H is just an upgrade from the GH5. It's not anything magical or mythical or something you don't already have. However, if you have the money and the resources and you've been wanting to get something like the S1H, I think it is a worthy camera considering all that Panasonic has put into this thing. There is so much functionality here that you don't get with pretty much any other camera right now. However, with the A7S III coming out soon, I do think it is time for the S1H to have a price drop. That is the one thing I would say about the S1H. It's like I want to recommend it and recommend, you know, people buy it, because I think honestly Panasonic should be rewarded for what they've done with this camera, because it is so powerful, because it caters to the type of shooting that I do. I'm gonna put this back because it's just getting heavy at this point. You know, the GH5 and the GH4, I picked the GH line even back from the GH1 just because of the video features, the ability to shoot video, good video on a hybrid camera. I think Panasonic should be rewarded for catering to that audience, like me personally, you know, like, and I'm sure there's plenty of other people out there, because when you look at the reviews of cameras and and YouTube and what people are looking at and what they're asking about, there's definitely a portion of people who are just in it for photography, and those people exist, and they have every right to just want photography. But I think there's a huge portion of people, when you look at videos from like Gerald or Peter McKinnon or Maddie or any of these people on YouTube that are making content regularly, they're usually doing both photo and video. And honestly, because of the nature of them making video, like that is a huge driver for them and for people like me and probably people like you. I want a camera that can do both really, really well, and specifically leaning towards video, doing video really well. Photo, I think this is maybe missed by some photographers out there and whatnot, but like photography, there are certain situations where you need a camera to be able to take, 20 frames a second, or you need it to have, a million autofocus points, or you need it to do something that it doesn't currently do. But for the most part, photography has been there for a while of kind of being at its, where you can basically pick up a camera and you can take shots and they're going to turn out great. And then guess what? You're going to take them into Photoshop and they're one image. And if there's a weird, if someone's not smiling quite right, you can make them smile a little bit more. If their teeth aren't quite white enough, you can make them a little whiter. If there's something annoying in the background, you can paint it out. If there's problems with the image, they're very easy to adjust in Photoshop. And so I look at photography as kind of this thing of like, it is continuing to get better, but the results are diminishing. You could still take a 5D Mark II or a 5D Mark III and take excellent, excellent photos with it. However, if you took a 5D Mark II or 5D Mark III and you shot video with it, it would pale in comparison to what you can do by today's standards of hybrid video shooting and just video in general, the dynamic range, right? Most of us haven't had RAW in the same way that photographers have had RAW for so long, and RAW is just now coming kind of into like the mainstream where it's accessible and it's easy to process, or easier to process and easier to work with. It's still not quite there yet to the same way it is with photography, where it's like, yeah, just shoot RAW. The photos are bigger, but you're talking about megabytes. With video, you're talking about gigabytes and terabytes of data, especially if you're shooting RAW and you're shooting high frame rate and all that stuff. I mean, you're basically taking photography and multiplying it by a factor of 30 or 60 or 120, 300, like these, just exponentially more data to process. It's harder to do because now you're dealing with a series of photos that all have to match in continuation, whether that's stabilization, whether that's focus, whether that's color and all the things, right? Exposure, white balance. With photography, it's one image and maybe it's part of a series, but you can adjust them individually. If there's a problem with the background of your video frame, you're probably gonna have to take it into After Effects. You have to do so much work, and so there's just this like effort that goes into the video side of things, that when these hybrids make that stuff easier or add value to it, or wow, I can get the colors that I want. Like photography, you can go in and paint, the teeth, you can paint all this stuff. But for video to have that, continuous in sequence, you got to do all this motion tracking and whatnot. So just to have good, rich color right out of the gate, whether it's RAW or it's 10-bit or 422, 420, all these things, they matter in terms of like ultimate quality that has been neglected for so long, because video is kind of thrown into these photography cameras, and we've got these hybrids, and they're just so convenient though. And I think that's why so many people like using them, because who wants to bring a giant, I mean, that's relative, they used to be much larger, but like a giant cinema camera on vacation? Like very few people want to do that. It's like you want to bring it to work, you want to bring it to a job, but as your camera that can just go in your backpack, I don't take my Ursa Mini with me places, because it's just not practical. You have to have these giant Anton Bauer batteries. You've got the lenses and the body itself, like everything, the shoulder rig, so much about it. It just makes it big because that's how you want it to be for a job. But just as your like go-to camera for, hey, I'm going to go to this place and I want to bring a camera, and oh, now I can do a time lapse. Now I can shoot video. Now I can do slow-mo. Having that functionality right in your backpack is fantastic. And that's why I think so many people gravitate towards that style of shooting, just because of the accessibility of it. It makes filming easy and fun in the same way that photography is easy and fun when it's just like right there with you. If it's not your smartphone in your pocket, you're just gonna bring the camera, and hopefully it does good autofocus. Hopefully it has good colors and whatnot. But the fact that it can also do amazing video when you need it, is a feature that I think shouldn't be taken for granted. And these aren't just photo cameras. The S1H is built for video. It's built for cinema. It's it still might be the only mirrorless camera rated for Netflix. I don't know if that's still true, but it definitely was at one point the first mirrorless camera for Netflix. So I mean, it's a worthy upgrade from the GH5, but if you already have a GH5 and you'd be stretching your budget, I think maybe wait for the S2H or wait for a price drop on the S1H. Right now, I believe, let's pop over, it's still $4,000, right? Yeah, $4,000. That's a lot of money to spend, especially if you don't have lenses. The 24 to 70 lens, that's a $2,000 lens. So it is an investment. However, I do like the mindset of the S1H. I like what Panasonic is doing. I think they should keep doing it, in which case that's why I would advocate someone buying an S1H if there's a price drop or if they just really want it, because Panasonic should be rewarded for the mindset they're putting into this. This is not, like the A7S III has a lot of video features that are nice. 4K 120, low light, autofocus, stabilization, etc. However, it's missing core fundamental things, just like shutter angle. The A7S III doesn't do shutter angle. Why? I don't know. It would be an easy thing to implement with software and firmware, but Sony just doesn't have that mentality. They're like, shutter speed's fine. And it is fine, and people can use it, as people have been using it, but just the mindset of having shutter angle in a hybrid, in a mirrorless camera, makes so much sense for the people who shoot that way. It's like, just include it. And the fact that the S1H was thought of as kind of this hybrid cinema filmmaking tool, I appreciate. And I think Panasonic should be rewarded for that, either with the S1H buying that or just investing in the system now for an inevitable, hopefully, S2 and S2H. I'm excited for what the future of this series has, as well as the series, the future of the GH line. If or when there is a GH6, I'm excited to see what they include, hopefully leaning in to those video aspects, because I can't think of a situation, the A7S III, people will make comments about, 12 megapixels, that's not enough for photography, you really need more for photos, and other people will disagree. But in the GH line and the S1 and the S1H, the S1R has more megapixels, but the GH5 is a 20 megapixel camera. The S1H is a 24 megapixel camera. That's definitely enough for photography. So nothing has been compromised on the photography side for the sake of video. It's not like it's, this like 8 megapixels or, 6 megapixels and, the video is great, but the photography sucks. It's like, no, you can do both. And you have the high megapixel count if you need it. For photography, not super high. You can obviously go higher if you really, really need. But I like that mindset, a true quality hybrid with a focus on video, cinema, filmmaking, to give people the tools they need to make content. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what camera you film with, because it's ultimately about the product. It's about the final image. And any viewer who's watching it any average viewer isn't really going to care or think about like, I wonder if they filmed that with, an S1H or an S1. Like, what did they use? Which one? Was it the H or did they shoot it on the S1? Is that a GH5 or did they shoot that on an A7S II? Was that a Red or an Alexa? Like, people are just watching the movie, they're just watching the TV show, they're just watching the YouTube video, and they say that looks nice or it looks bad. Whatever's out there is what they judge. And very few people are thinking about like what they used to capture it, unless they're kind of, techie and into camera equipment like we are, but most regular people aren't thinking about that stuff. So really it's about the final image, and how that looks is the most important thing. Aside from that, the camera should be about like, okay, does it make it easy to get a beautiful final image? Because that's why you buy the tool, for the sake of getting to the final spot. It's not just about the specs of like, for the spec's sake, it's for like, okay, this makes it easier or quicker to achieve that final output. And that's, again, another reason why I like the hybrid style of shooting. It just makes filming really convenient, really fast. You can go anywhere, you can film anything and make it look pristine rather than having to kit out and rig out a whole cinema camera and then, oops, I forgot this one piece and now I can't film, or, oh, I can't do this because I don't have that accessory, or, oh, it's, you know, my batteries are dying, or whatever the situation might be. It's like the simpler it is usually the more efficient you can be in the process of acquisition and getting good shots, because then you can think more creatively about, especially in the kind of like documentary style that I end up filming a lot of my content in, is like you can on the fly make judgment calls about like, oh yeah, I'm going to get this shot really quick and it's going to be awesome, and then I can move to that next shot and that's going to be awesome, and then I can move to that next shot and that's going to be awesome, rather than like storyboarding out, you know, your 20 shots for the day or whatever it is, and you go and you get those and then you go home. I like the in the moment creativity of something is happening organically, I'm going to capture it in the best way possible. And a lot of times, you know, the hybrid style allows for that, or the ENG style, which is what the Ursa Mini has embraced, right? Of this kind of broadcast, run and gun, ENG news gathering style, but with a cinema camera with a big sensor. And even stuff like, you know, when Blackmagic put ND filters in the Ursa Mini Pro, there are people who would make the comment like, oh, cinema cameras don't have built-in NDs. Like you get a matte box. Yeah, but like what's the downside to having them built in, especially if now you don't need the matte box, you don't need those big filters, and everything's right inside and you can run and gun and kind of get stuff on the fly that looks cinematic in that kind of like documentary filmmaker style. I really like the tools that make that easy. And you know, 180 degree shutter angle is one of those things. Having shutter angle makes it really easy, because then you're switching frame rates on the fly for different scenes, and you're not constantly changing your shutter speed like you'd have to do on some other cameras. So it's just like some of those little things, and it's some of the inconveniences about the S1H, like the things that just get in the way or that are just kind of annoying or irritating, which I did in my previous video, of just the things that kind of caught me off guard as being kind of weird or kind of odd. None of those are deal breakers, but they're the things that can maybe obstruct your ability to be creative on the fly and to move efficiently. Because if you're able to get 100 beautiful shots in a day, you know, compared to another camera that maybe only get 50 or maybe only get 30, you know, that can have a significant impact on the final product, because now you have 100 beautiful images or pieces of footage to work with, rather than walking away with 30 and that's it, and maybe you're you know, less flexible in post-production and piecing the story together. So that's the approach I come at it from, and why I bought the GH5 and why I think the GH5 is so incredible, and why I really like the S1H as well and what it offers as the upgrade from the GH5. I'll pop back into the chat here. Let's see. I have a really silly question. Which Panasonic camera would you recommend as a first camera, primarily for video? That really depends. As a first camera, that it has to be a Panasonic. I mean, there's so many. You could get like the DVX200 as like a camcorder style one. You could get a Varicam. You could get the EVA1. You know, if you're looking for something cinema, if it's the GH4, GH5, or the S1H. I think the GH5 is maybe a better entry point than the S1H. If that's what we're talking about, the difference between the GH5 and the S1H, I think GH5 is a much easier entry point, but it's a different, you know, lens mount and sensor format than the S1H. So if it's a long-term commitment and you want to go full frame eventually, you know, maybe it makes more sense to get into the L mount, which is that's what this is, and then this is micro four third. So, but purely just based on the cameras and ease of use and like what's a smaller bite to take, definitely the GH5. The S1H is probably overkill if you're just getting into video. Get the G7 with 2 kit lens. That's not a bad recommendation either. Even the lesser, you know, cameras, there's what, the G9 is the littler version of the GH5. I mean, get what you can afford, and ultimately just get what's going to be, if you're not sure about the long-term commitment, don't spend too much. Last thing you want to do is be one of those people that like puts, you know, $50,000 into a RED system and then realizes you don't actually want to be a cinematographer. Like, start small, start with the bare minimum, get something used, get used to it and see if it's something you pick up and then you want to upgrade. Because at that point, you'll have a better frame of reference of like what you actually need and which direction you want to go, and you can make your own decision from there. I feel like Panasonic has no real plan for their cameras. Seems like the GH5 or 6 or the S1H and the EVA1 are all competing in the same range, maybe less so the EVA1 that we hear nothing about. Just thoughts. Yeah, I said this on stream the other night. The EVA1 caters to a market that I don't think really exists anymore. Not because Panasonic is, you know, aided up with their own line. It just that market, I think, kind of just disappeared into hybrid. Those are the video shooters that, you know, 10 years ago who would love an EVA1 went even smaller and they moved to hybrid mirrorless systems. Whereas everybody who wants something bigger went that way as well. It's just a style of camera. You see those even from like JVC, Panasonic still makes them, Sony still has them for that matter, Canon still does. These kind of like camcorder style cameras with bigger sensors that maybe have interchangeable lenses, maybe they don't. That's like the DVX 200 as well. Like there's just some cameras out there that I don't really know what the market is for. I guess theoretically it could be, you know, live video situations, you know, news type stuff, but you know, a lot of those they're still doing the big bulky broadcast cameras because that's what their systems are, and they're fine. So yeah, the newer cameras in that camcorder style always kind of surprise me a little bit because I just don't know that many people that are excited about that style of camera. The G series are a consumer brand. The GH series are prosumer professional bodies with a high focus on video. The S line is strictly professional, S1 photography, and S1H for videography. Yep, that's a pretty distinct and clear map, so I'm not sure what you mean. Your lighting looks so damn good. Haha, thanks for sharing. I still haven't tried the S1H still. Well, thanks, Dave. Oh, goodbye, Dave. He retracted the message. Sorry. Oh, he wrote it. Must have been a typo in there somewhere. Your lighting looks so damn good. Thanks for sharing. I still haven't tried an S1H. I'd say definitely test it out. So mine was a rental from Lens Rentals. They are, if we look at the price, relatively affordable for like 7 days, which I think is totally fine for like, you know, to try. Oh, look, there's like a coupon, $25 off. $200 for 7 days for the S1H. And I think if you're on the fence, definitely get one before you put down the money to buy it. Lens Rentals even has a program where like if it's like try before you buy. So if you do rent it and you want to keep it, you can buy the camera from them. Granted, it's a used one that's been, you know, rented before, so I don't know if that bothers you at all, but it does come at a discount. It's kind of like used pricing, plus it takes off the price of the rental. So if you're on the fence and you're like, oh, I want to buy this camera, and maybe you're looking at buying it used for whatever reason, and you rent it, the rental gives you a discount, and then you get the used price on it, and you can just keep it if you fall in love with it. Right now, I haven't fallen in love with the S1H. It's not like oh, I have to buy it, I have to have it. There's a lot that I like about it. I have to keep using it, but I don't know. If it were cheaper, I think it'd be kind of an obvious, like, yes, absolutely. As it is right now, it's harder to make that call, especially because the A7S III is coming, and that does offer significantly more in terms of like frame rates for like 4K 120. But it's not a video tool. It's more of that, like, it's a photography camera, and I don't know. I want to get my hands on it because I don't know about the build quality, but the Sony cameras I've used in the past, I have not been impressed with the build quality. The S1H is like a tank. I mean, it's sturdy, and maybe that's a bad thing that it's big and bulky, but it's also a good thing in that it doesn't feel like a toy. Where like the A7S and the A7S II, in my mind, have always, when I've used them, I've played with them, they always feel kind of like plasticky, kind of cheap, kind of like it's just gonna break. And I don't know about the A7S III, but it still has that kind of same Sony vibe where it's like good features, certainly. And I'm sure there are features that will come to a GH6 and an S2. And that's ultimately the thing, is like, there's a lot of cool cameras coming right now from Canon and Sony that people are very, very excited for. However, Panasonic, the GH5 is old now. Like the GH6 technically should have probably already been at least announced. in terms of if you look at timelines from, GH3 to GH4 to GH5, that same gap, we're past it now for the GH6. So the GH6 is late. Now, is that due to like global events? I'm sure. But also, are we going to have to wait, 2 or 3 more years? I don't think so. I think a GH6 is coming sooner rather than later. And it may be the situation where everybody's, jumping ship A7S III or going to Canon for whatever reason. I don't know. They just like burning their hands on overheating cameras. That's a joke. They don't actually get that hot, but they definitely overheat, and I think they're kind of unusable for proper video work. But in any case, you have people like, it feels like that time of like, oh, there's a lot of cool stuff coming. Blackmagic has this 12K. The red Komodo is now starting to come out, and that's really cool. And you've got like the Mavo LF, the Zcam E2, F6 is relatively new. So there's like a lot of really new stuff that's like, offering substantial upgrades in terms of resolution, frame rate, codec, like RAW, becoming more ubiquitous out there. And yet there's no GH6 out yet or even like announced. And while the S1H came out last year in September, theoretically they could release an S2 or an S2H also next year, maybe end of this year they announce it, or I don't know. I don't know what they would actually plan to do there, but I hope there's an S2 and an S2H. It definitely deserves to be one, and they should keep investing in it, because I think that's really, if the S1H came out earlier, which it really should have, like Panasonic is late to the game for full frame mirrorless. They took their sweet time. They stayed with micro four thirds for so long. And it's like, you got to have full frame. It's the one thing that people always say about the GH5. Oh, but it's not full frame. It's not full frame. That and the autofocus, right? They solve those two things. I think they're head and shoulders above everybody else. From my perspective, again, because I'm focused on video, filmmaking, cinema, photography, I can take beautiful photos on a GH5. I pull them into Photoshop, you do your color, you make them look awesome. And is there stuff that's easier to do full frame? Yeah. Is it technically better? Yeah. But in photography, when everything's posted on Instagram, I think the differences are kind of negligible at this point, and they have been for quite a while. What gets me more excited is the video features, because now we're in uncharted territory. I mean, 4K 120 on the A7S III, that's a huge feature and a huge selling point for that camera, because it's new and cutting edge. Well, the GH6 may end up having it. The S2 or the S2H may end up having it. It probably definitely has to have it, and it could even have more, right? That's a 6K camera, and as I showed, 6K is substantial. The moment it's 8K, because they've already got a body that has fans in it, so I mean, keeping it cool theoretically isn't a problem for Panasonic. There's just so much potential that could be coming really, really soon. And that's what has me excited just about the industry. I mean, if you're a Sony shooter, the A7S III is a no-brainer. If I had a bunch of Sony lenses, absolutely, I'd get the A7S III, no question. If I had Canon stuff, well, I'm glad I don't have RF lenses. Nothing Canon's been doing has gotten me interested in their system, so I don't think that would have happened. But there definitely could have been, a alternate dimension where I was a Sony shooter and I got the A7S and the A7S II. That could have happened. I mean, it was the debate at the time in my head between GH4, GH5, or A7S, A7S II. So theoretically, I could have been a Sony shooter and I'd have all the Sony stuff. And yeah, I'd get the A7S III. Of course I would. But the fact that I don't means that I'm more invested in the Lumix lens line and the Lumix like mentality of shooting, just in the menus and whatnot. And there's stuff that is attractive about like the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. But with that, it's like the great thing about having a mirrorless mount, which I know the Pocket Cinema camera 4K does, it's micro four thirds, so the sensor is smaller and it has the mirrorless mount. But then for the 6K, they did the EF mount, which pretty soon we're all going to realize the benefits of mirrorless with, and we already have, right? This is not like new, but it's really going to be hammered in sooner rather than later in that, you know, ND filters. So right now on the GH5, I use a speed booster to get to a Super 35 field of view. So I have to have the speed booster on the GH5. I do sometimes use it with like the native glass, but most of the time I'm shooting with that Super 35 field of view, either with like the 18 to 35 Sigma lens, which is like the no-brainer. If you have a GH5, you probably have a speed booster and a Sigma 18 to 35, because that's just like such a beautiful combination of glass and camera. It just works for so many different reasons. However, that limits me to always having that speed booster in there, meaning I can't put any kind of like ND adapter on the camera because I want that Super 35 field of view. The moment you go beyond Super 35 and now you're at full frame, mirrorless, you can still use all the old EF lenses and adapt them to, you know, L mirrorless or Sony E mount or whatever, and then you can use a variable ND in the adapter. And that's kind of the one final component or missing piece for the hybrid style of shooting that, you know, takes a, people tend to want to upgrade to the cinema cameras or the, you know, the Canon C200, 300, 500, etc., and that line of stuff, or like the Blackmagic Ursa Mini Pro, because it has the built-in NDs. Built-in NDs, as I was showing with this footage, is like I had to use an ND filter on a lot of stuff because it's outside. Like it's too much light. Like you can't, like I don't want to shoot at f22. I want to be able to shoot at like 2.8 or f4, you know, and have an ND. So the fact that you can have old EF lenses, and old, it's relative, right? They're still new, but you know, the older EF lenses, so designed for a, you know, mirror box style mount, put an ND filter, variable ND or some kind of like electronic ND in that adapter from the EF lenses to the L mount or from the EF to the E mount. That, in my mind, is like the immediate near future of like, that is my like new standard, right? Right now my standard is GH5 with speed booster, but I can easily imagine a future where my standard is S1H, and then I have some kind of, you know, electronic or variable ND adapter, and then I'm using EF lenses. So EF, like I have cinema primes. I've got a bunch of old EF lenses, the 70 to 200. I have a 24 to 70. Like I even had, like the 18 to 35 would still work because you can use the S1H in Super 35 crop mode. The 50 to 100 Sigma 1.8. Like there's so much good EF glass out there that I already have and is, you know, relatively easy to come by, and probably is going to be cheaper now that things are moving towards RF, you know, Canon's mirrorless mount. So that to me is the near immediate future of like the best way to film with a hybrid, because then I don't need a speed booster anymore. I'm kind of like over that, done with it. It's kind of a limitation in that I always have to have it on the camera, and I'd rather just do away with it. Now, what I will say, sorry, I'm going to get back to the chat in a second, but I will say on the S1H, I did rent the Sigma. I have it back there in the case. It's the Sigma MC11. I believe it has a hyphen in it. So yeah, the Sigma MC11. No, it's not that one. That's the E-mount one. And there is, what in the world is going on with their website? Well, we can look at this one. It's the L mount one. This is the Sony E mount, but there's a Panasonic one. Let me just find it because it's bugging me. I gotta have the right one. Why is it not on here? That's interesting. Let's see. L mount. All right, now I'm on an adventure. Now I'm on a journey. You gotta see. Oh, it's the MC21. Sorry. The MC11 is for Sony. The MC21 is the L mount one. My mistake. This adapter didn't work for the lens I have. Now, that's not to say this adapter doesn't work. There is a warning, the disclaimer they put on here that it doesn't work with Leica or whatever, but it should work with the S1H. However, oh yeah, see, it is not compatible with Leica branded L mount cameras. So I put on the S1H, it should work, but I have a cheap, it's the, let's go over to Amazon. It's the Mikey 85 millimeter f1.8. It's just a cheap 85 millimeter lens. I believe, yeah, it's this one. Cheap lens. It's nothing special. It's not setting the world on fire in terms of image performance, but it's, you know, it's fun to just play around with as just like a cheap 85 that will do autofocus, which is kind of what I wanted to test with the adapter. However, this lens, it wouldn't let me control aperture with this MC21. It registered, it showed up on the camera fine, but I couldn't adjust the aperture. I pulled the lens out, I pulled the adapter off, I powered everything down, powered it back up. It never worked. This is a goofy off-brand lens, so I suspect that's kind of what the issue. However, it was a disappointment that this didn't work. So it's not always like you could just use an adapter and it'll work. However, that's why I usually like the kind of dummy style adapters that don't necessarily require, full electronic communication, because then you have to wait for a firmware update in certain situations where your lens isn't compatible. Just something to know that I discovered with my personal set of equipment and how I rented the S1H. So I don't know if that's helpful in any meaningful way, but it's something I came across. Your lighting looks so damn... Oh, yeah, read that one. I assume it's this lighting. Thank you. It's just a relatively basic setup, but it definitely is overkill for a live stream. S1H focus yet? Focus yet? I did focus testing, like autofocus with the S1H, but it's not as good as the Sony and the Canon, but it does work. Like for photography, it definitely works, and for video, I would use it if I needed to for certain situations, but also a lot of time, like I don't always need it to. I know there's some people who shoot with a camera on a gimbal and they need, like specifically I've heard about this for weddings. Now I don't shoot a lot of weddings. I have done them in the past, but I don't do weddings. It's not my core business. If you shoot weddings and you need autofocus all the time on a gimbal, I get it. Sony or Canon, yes, that's probably the way to go. It's better autofocus technology. However, if you're worried that the S1H has like terrible autofocus and everything's going to be blurry, that's also not true either. It's just less reliable. I wouldn't count on it. I would probably do it manually, but the same thing applies to the GH5, and I've been shooting with that for a while and it hasn't been an issue. I have 4 GH5s and had 4 GH4s and 2 G7s. They're great cameras, and the fact that they're so cheap means you can buy a lot of them, which is excellent. So GH5 there, GH5 here, and then there's a GH5 over there, and then probably another one somewhere. I'm going to be patient. Yeah, it's that price tag for me. If the S1H was closer to the 2800 range, I would be much more interested. Yeah, I'm right there with you, Steve. 3000 would be a sweet spot for the S1H. If they reduce it, they'll probably do this stupid thing of like, well, there's a $200 rebate. And it's like, no. Panasonic, listen to me. You need to bring the price down below the A7S III. I know it's going to hurt your feelings. You made the S1H is a beautiful camera, but you have a lot of people out there who will not switch from Sony. And now that the A7S III does 4K 120, it doesn't matter that you got all these great cinema features. People see 4K 120 and they look at the S1H and they go, oh, that only does 4K 60? I'm going to get the Sony. That's the mentality that they're competing with. People know all the details, all the ins and outs. I can talk about how this is a great video camera and it's for filmmakers and etc. And I'm still telling you, Panasonic, the A7S III looks awesome, and the fact that it's $3,500 and it does 4K 120 makes me want to buy it, and it makes me not want to buy the S1H. Just being honest. Zcam, 8K full frame. I think Panasonic knows that any future hybrid camera they release has to have great video autofocus, otherwise it is dead in the water. Yes, they've got to figure that out. Now, can they do it? I don't know. We'll see. I think the IBIS, IS lock, and dual IBIS are game-changing. Yeah. Does the S1H have IS lock? Yes, it does. It's called IS Boost. I think it's Boost. It makes more sense on the GH5 because the GH5 calls it lock, like stabilization lock, like it's a tripod. The S1H has it too. It's called Boost, and it does work. and the MC5 kicks out the jams. Cameras are so good nowadays that it's hard to go wrong. That is true. Pretty much anything you buy is going to make beautiful images, and like I said before, that's what ultimately viewers watch and care about. You know, I don't like it, the camera is just a helpful tool that makes capturing beautiful images easier and easier and easier over time, and gives you features like, you know, slow-mo or IBIS or autofocus, all these things that make it easier to get nice images help, but all the cameras do it sort of well, and then the final images all look really good too. So it's kind of like your preference at this point, as well as like the specifics of exactly what you need. Like I was talking about before with weddings, it's like if you need autofocus, then yeah, your choice is clear. If you want other things like anamorphic, well, S1H or GH5 are kind of the way to go, because Sony and Canon don't do that. The Z6 AF works quite well now too. Oh, interesting. Is that the Nikon Z6? Have you tried the Siru? No, I have not, but I will say if you want an anamorphic tip or you're curious, let me grab this stuff real quick. So this is the SLR Magic Anamorphic 2X, which this is the one thing, the Siru stuff, they're 1.33x anamorphics, which is fine if you're shooting 16:9, but the whole point of anamorphic is to really have the anamorphic effect, really de-squeeze it. And the GH5 and the S1H make that easy because you can shoot 4:3, and then you want the 2x. So it doesn't have to be the SLR Magic Anamorphic. This anamorphic adapter, it goes on the front of a lens. It's not perfect by any means. Let me take the caps off and you can see it a little bit better. Hopefully you can see which is the right angle for the lights. There you go. That looks nice. So you can see, you know, this is a nice 2x anamorphic. This does not work well with most lenses. So for example, if you try and put this on the Sigma 18-35, which is probably the most common lens that people use on the GH5 with the speed booster, you will be underwhelmed because it doesn't look great. If anything, I think it portholes on the 18-35 with the speed booster. So don't expect you're going to use that. And there's a lot of other lenses where it doesn't work all that well. However, and I have a video that I shot a while ago that I just need to get around to editing that shows this kind of in practice. This is another one of those Mikey lenses. This is a 35 prime lens for micro four third, so for the GH5. Tiny little lens, 35 millimeter, which is about the widest you can use on micro four third. So 35 or longer you can use with this anamorphic adapter on the GH5. Anything wider than 35 is pretty much going to porthole. So meaning you're going to see the inside of this. So when you combine these two, and I don't have the filter right now, you just get one step up ring. Go from, this is 49, and I believe the back of this, I would have to check. Is it 69 or 68? 62? I forget off the top of my head. I have a step up ring that basically attaches these two, and this is a beautiful, beautiful combination. This is manual aperture, manual focus. In fact, I can pull it up here. Very cheap too. Very, very cheap lens. I think it's the 1.8 or 1.4. There actually might be a 1.8 version of this as well. Let's see. Which one did I get? I got the 1.4. So it's $100 for this lens. And you can attach it to the Anamorphic, which this is, I think, $1,000. I don't know if it's gone up or down. I've had it for a long, long time, and I very rarely use it because I don't shoot a lot of anamorphic. It's just kind of inconvenient. Sometimes, you know, for a lot of like commercial style projects or high-end work, they don't even like the anamorphic look because it's kind of too dreamy in some ways. It's not the sharpest, definitely, right? If you've done anamorphic, you've done anything like that, you know there's limitations associated with it unless you're getting high-end, you know, Hawk anamorphics, or there's now there's the Orion who makes, there's the Atlas ones, and then I think there's, I forget. There's a few boutique anamorphic lens companies that'll do it. But if you want to do it on the cheap, you can get one of these, as well as the SLR Magic Anamorphic, because then you get the actual 2X, which is what you would want. There is a version 2 of this, so yeah, it's $1,000. There's a Siru one that's, you know, $700, but you don't get the 2X. And I have the old LA 7200 Anamorphic, and that's a 1.33 as well. And I always wanted 2X. I wanted 2X, and it does make a difference. You get more anamorphic effect the more you're stretching the image, and the fact that the GH5 and the S1H record 4:3 as a mode, it's like that's what it's intended for. So the fact that you can do it that way with this cheap lens, you're basically making kind of a Siru type of thing. It is a little bit more expensive, and again, it's not quite perfect. You got to like double focus, and because you have 2 sets of focus rings. Even the Anamorphic has like an option to do like near and far focus that you can like, so you focus there and you focus on the lens. Once you kind of get in the rhythm of it though, and you realize what works in which situations, all based on distance from your subject, you kind of know, okay, if I dial this stuff in, that's going to be the sharpest image. Because sometimes if you have the Anamorphic set to normal, you're like, why is this not in focus? Why is it not in focus? And you kind of like go towards near, and you're like, it's still not in focus, it's still not in focus. It's like, oh, it's somewhere in between. You kind of have to meet in the middle in both lenses. It's a little complicated, a little tricky. But once you get the hang of it, you can make some really, really nice images, and then, you know, get that cinema style. That's, you know, kind of unique and interesting, and doesn't apply for every project, but if you're into it, that's kind of at least my recommendation based on the stuff I have that I've personally used. This lens, once I bought this I was like $100, I'll test it, because typically what you want with the Anamorphics is like a cheap, super basic prime lens. And when I found that, I was like, oh, Micro Four Third, perfect. Like, the Speed Booster introduced weird stuff because it's like more glass in there, and that was kind of affecting things in a bad way. And then I tried some older vintage like Nikon lenses that were like not quite working for me. So I found that $100, and I was like, okay, let's test this out. I'll roll the dice, and it worked out great. Really, really well. Very happy with the image. Let's see, I have the 2X as well. I use the Anamorphic 2X on the 42.5 1.2, and it's beautiful. I think the L mount hurts the S1H. What should they have gone with, Eugene? I'm curious. What mount, like, should they have gone RF? E mount? Like, that'd be more. I guess they could have, I suppose. I think the back of the Anamorphic is 62 millimeters, and the front of it is 77. The front is definitely 77, but they don't tell you what the back is, so you do have to look that up. But the front is 77. It's just the back that's not marked on the lens itself. You have to go look that up, but I think, Dave, you are correct. It is the 62 millimeter. Thanks for the info. Usually on the 42.5 millimeter, even though it can do 1.2, it looks nicer at 2 or 2.8. With the Anamorphics in general, stopping down does help. If you're shooting wide open with your prime, that's going to make really blurry, really soft images. Stop down 2, 2.8, even f4 if you're struggling with the stuff in focus and it being sharp. Definitely. ISO Ultra Star 2X are quite a bit sharper than the Atlas Orion lenses. It depends on the characteristics you want. You still need a focus solution for most of the lenses you build. Interesting, Steve. I haven't played with the ISO Ultrastar 2X or even the Atlas Orion lenses. There's one, what's the other one that's like Apollo? Am I thinking correctly? Apollo Anamorphic. Let me put this down so I'm not typing with one hand. And Zelmus, that's the one. Apollo, these are the other ones. So Zelmus, Apollo Anamorphics. They're expensive, I'm sure. And then there's Atlas Orion Anamorphic, which are also cool and high-end, but maybe, I don't know. I haven't personally used them, so I don't know if they're sharp or not, but I do know that you will struggle with the Anamorphic if you don't have the right prime lens. So the right combination is gonna steer you the wrong way. Or you need the right combination. I don't know what I was saying. I got distracted by footage of anamorphic stuff. So you can check this out. I mean, anamorphic is that thing is like, if you don't, hopefully you know if you need it, or if you just want to play and dabble, the Zero stuff I'm sure is fine. The SLR Magic stuff is fine. Like it's at least gets you in, and it's not, you know, $9,000. You're talking about $1,000. It's still expensive. You know, don't get me wrong. It's not like a cheap thing to get into, but if you're curious and you want to play around with it, there's definitely affordable ways to get into it, and then you can kind of see if it's for you and the way you shoot. It will slow you down. You can't shoot as fast, anamorphic, which is a good thing and a bad thing. But if you're used to kind of more of the run and gun style, anamorphic will be a challenge for you, because it's just not, that's not how you do it. You really got to dial everything in. And that, I mean, that just comes with doing it and testing out and trying it for yourself, and then seeing, oh wow, I'm a lot slower this way, because it just takes time. So that may then after the fact make you go, I don't know if I really like shooting anamorphic. In which case, you got your answer right there. If I'm any indication, you know, I was really into anamorphic and I wanted to do all this stuff, and I got the LA 7200, and I was like, oh, this isn't quite right. Maybe I'll get the Anamorphic from SLR Magic, and then even then I'm like, you know, this just doesn't suit my needs the way I wish it did. Maybe anamorphic isn't for me all the time. I still like doing it. I think it's fun because I have the tools to do it, but it's not something where it's like day in, day out I'm shooting anamorphic, because it's kind of a burden and it's kind of a hassle. Even though the Ursa Mini Pro will let you do 2x anamorphic, the GH5 and the S1H will let you do it, it's not what I look at those cameras as like one of the main selling features. Even though some people will say, oh, they shoot anamorphic, it's like, yeah, but then you need lenses and you need the whole, not workflow in terms of processing the files, because that part's easy, like the stretching and squeezing, that part's easy. It's just the actual shooting with anamorphics can be a challenge. Popping back into the chat, and I'm gonna wrap this up here. The Anamorphic shop on YouTube does some comparisons with the Atlas lenses. Favorite lens for the S1H, and then RF. Eugene says they should have gone RF. That would be interesting if Panasonic and Canon had this same mount. I'm gonna take a sip of water because it's getting dry. Been talking for too long. Needed a little sip. The RF lenses on a Panasonic would be interesting. I don't think they would do it. I don't think that's possible. I mean, it makes sense that Panasonic and Leica teamed up, and then Sigma jumped in there as well. I think that all makes sense. With the L mount, we'll see. We'll see how it plays out long run. I think Canon's gonna have a hard time. They're gonna get some people going to RF, but if they don't start making cameras that capture the wider audience, there's so many people who have gone to Sony who used to shoot Canon, right? And they've just gone to Sony and they've gone E-mount, and it is what it is. The E-mount though was designed, and this came up in the chat the other night, that the E-mount was designed for APS-C, because if you recall, Sony used to do those NEX cameras. They still might make them. I'm not sure if the NEX line is still around, but those were like decently popular hybrid-ish cameras. You know, it was right at the beginning of all that. And then they went full frame because they fit a full frame sensor into the E-mount. But apparently someone was saying that it's not quite big enough, or as big as it should be compared to the RF mount. And I don't know enough about the L mount truly to know if it's significantly better for any reason or significantly worse than RF or E-mount. But I do know that most of the glass I imagine using on an L mount or an RF mount or an E-mount wouldn't be native glass. I probably, if I got the S1H or if I got the A7S III, which is right now the two kind of top contenders in my mind, if I got either one of those cameras, I would probably have one lens for photography that I would use. It probably wouldn't be the 24-70. That's what's on there now, but I just find it's not as sharp as I'd like it to be for photography. It's fine as a universal lens, like run and gun, get whatever. But if I'm gonna get a lens for photography, I would probably get like a nice 85, I think is what I would get for the S1H or the A7S III. I'd get an 85 prime for photography, for autofocus, And then everything else, I would probably adapt with, you know, like from old EF lenses or old Nikon lenses, anything like that that you can easily adapt to the L mount, and then, you know, sacrificing things like autofocus, which is fine for video and the way I shoot because I do manual focus, but that's how I would do it on the S1H. So, you know, S1H, yeah, I'd pick like an 85 prime native mount for photography, purely for autofocus. Same thing on the A7S III, and then I'd go manual focus, like old school lenses with adapters, either smart or dummy, probably with some kind of built-in ND. There's the Photo DX makes some. I haven't tested them, so I don't actually know their quality, but I saw they sent an email saying they have some adapter sale going on right now. They have their smart ND throttle ones. So they're the dummy ones, but then they have the smart ones, which, oh my goodness, I've never been to their site. This is tons of stuff. Let's see, what do we got? All right, let's filter this down to, maybe I'd have to go look at this. I gotta, there, hold on. Let's just do the photo, ND Smart. Do it this way, get right to it. Is this gonna take me to it, or is this gonna take me to a landing page? Pro Fusion adapter, smart. There's one of these they make that's ND and it's electronic contacts. That's probably the one I'd get. I think it's like 300 or 400 bucks, but that's what I'd look at, getting something like that, just so I can have the built-in NDs in the adapter, right? Like that, to me, is the missing piece to all the hybrid stuff. If they, like in the S2 or the GH5, if they can do the NDs right in the camera, which I've said I think they should do, if Panasonic is listening, put an electronic ND in the camera, solves all my problems, makes me say thank you, thank you, thank you, because it's good for photo and for video. It's not just a video thing. It's for photography too. You can do long exposures during the day and get all that beautiful motion blur all in your image, whether it's a waterfall or whatever it is, and you can take some awesome photos using kind of a slow shutter speed. And that's what I want. I want the ability to have the NDs right there. I don't need XLR inputs. If they were going to do them, it'd probably be with a breakout cable anyway, which I think is kind of annoying. Don't need XLR inputs. I've adapted to, you know, stereo inputs and all that, those shenanigans. It's just the ND. It's the missing component of the, people say the exposure triangle. I think that's a phrase, right? Aperture, ISO, shutter, your exposure triangle, but it's not. It's an exposure square. You have ND on there as well, because you can just straight up just block light with a filter. So add that to the equation. Makes me very, very happy. Wrapping this up, get the Anamorphics on a budget buyer's guide before you buy any lenses. Anamorphics on a budget buyer's guide is probably a thing out there. Do a Google search. Thank you so much for your time. This was cool. You're welcome, Dave. Thanks for all the good info. You're welcome, Hutch. I would adapt to the L mount too. Yes, Steve, that would be my plan. I have and still am invested in EF glass, but I'm going to invest in new glass as a system for the future. It is going to be either E-mount or RF. I buy bodies to suit my lenses. That's totally valid, Eugene. I mean, lenses should last you longer than the camera. The Canon makes great lenses. Don't get me wrong. They just don't make the bodies I want. So theoretically, you get the red Komodo because that has an RF mount, if that's what you want. I imagine Blackmagic will embrace the RF mount as well. They've been so keen to use EF mounts on all their cameras just because EF is so popular. If RF is popular in the same way, maybe they'll do the same. But I can also imagine E-mount. It's just been around longer. More people have been doing Sony mirrorless. I mean, it's pretty much the longest lasting one, still standing. So they might go E-mount as well. Who's to say? Who's to know? No one can predict the future. Olympus has electronic ND, but I'm not sure you can use it in video mode. Interesting. That's new information to me. But again, I don't look at the Olympus cameras all that much because they seem to be not as video centric as Panasonic has been with Lumix and the GH line, and then now the S1H. It's my personal preference. It's what I'm particularly into. video features, making filmmaking, or it doesn't have to even be filmmaking. It's it's just any kind of video, but having that filmmaker cinema mindset, making it look good, making it sound good, telling good stories with good footage is what I enjoy. And being able to do that in a hybrid is a lot of fun because it just means you can have a camera pretty much anywhere you go, and you can shoot compelling footage whether you're traveling or you're just you're on a paid shoot. If the camera can do it all, that's kind of the goal, rather than having something specifically for like, oh, this is only for premium high-end film work, which is valid, and you need certain cameras for those situations as well. But the GH5 and the S1H do a really, really good job for what they are and how cheap they are, relatively speaking. Granted, $4,000 for an S1H isn't cheap, but it is cheap in the grand scheme of things compared to other cameras that, if you wanted to shoot something that's like Netflix certified, well, it's like the S1H, or prices go up from there. So that's like low end. Just some thoughts there. Have I decided if it's worth it to upgrade to the S1H from the GH5? I don't know if I have a clear answer there one way or the other, but hopefully this conversation has given you a little bit of context for at least my perspective on it and how I approach it and the stuff I've done. It is a worthy upgrade in terms of it is better than the GH5, but is it significantly better? That's really up to the individual to decide, and how you shoot your projects. If the GH5 probably does most of what you need, but if you need that a little bit extra secret sauce from the S1H, maybe it is worth it for you for that extra little bit. RF lens mount has better potential than the E mount. Yeah, I think Steve, you were the one talking the other night about the E mount being not quite the right size for a full frame sensor. So I would tend to agree. The Canon glass also, I think, is better than the Sony glass that I've seen out there right now, just because I've been investigating both systems. And if Canon had just done a decent job, or decent enough job with the R5 and R6, because who was it? Is it Armando did a video basically talking about how, yes, the R5 overheats in certain modes, and so you can shoot in not 4K HQ. Granted, I'm aware of the taking the cards out thing and recording externally, and that's somehow a way to do 4K 30 HQ. I get it, but like leaving aside external recording solutions and just looking at what Canon released, the R5 you can shoot 4K 30, not HQ, but you can shoot 4K 30 in camera and it won't overheat. That's great. However, that 4K mode is not as good because it's pixel binned or line skipped, one of the two, I forget. But it's compromised. It's not good, high quality 4K. It's more like the kind of garbage, not garbage, the lesser than 1080p from the 5D Mark III, let's say. So it's 4K on the R5, but it's not HQ. It's not as good as the 4K should be. What's the better 4K 30 is on the R6, because that's doing a proper sensor downscale from, 5.1K to 4K on the R6. So it's doing like a true like 1-to-1 downsample instead of the pixel bending or line skipping, whatever the R5 is doing. However, if you get the R6, that's the mode that overheats on the R6. So then you have to drop that one down to like 1080. So it's this, pick your poison. It's like, yeah, you can use the R5 down to a certain point that it won't overheat, but like really that mode is better on the R6, but then that's the mode that overheats on the R6. So then you have to drop that one down to 1080, and then you have to, so then like you're constantly, if you bought an R5 and an R6, you theoretically could be shuffle jumping between these cameras, but that's just like, it is such a headache. And I get that people want the autofocus and they love Canon and they have RF lenses. I get it. I have no hate for you if you like Canon, but I'm just saying from my perspective, that is unusable and a complete inconvenience for the way that I shoot. I would get far less done. The projects would be compromised, constantly worrying about cameras overheating and shuffling things around. Can they fix it with a firmware update, as some people are hoping and praying and saying, please Canon, save us? I don't hold your breath. If it was coming, I think they wouldn't have released them or put them out there as they are now if there was even the possibility to do it. Why it overheats, I don't know exactly why. Is it the cards? Is it the camera? who knows? Something about the camera isn't quite right, and it causes it to overheat in these certain modes. So either the R5 or the R6, you're buying cameras for video modes that you can only use a fraction of the time. Otherwise, you're recording compromised footage. Not even an option. So your option is Sony, but then yeah, the mount isn't quite ideal for full frame. So then theoretically, you hope the L mount takes off in a meaningful way, but Panasonic, Leica, and Sigma are all, kind of the underdogs in this story that don't really, haven't been doing full frame, at least Panasonic anyway. Sigma's new to the game in general with the FP. That I think is neat and is cool, and hopefully they continue to evolve. But Panasonic is just getting into the full frame game. They have a lot of ground to catch up on, which is why I encourage a price drop on the S1H, like a significant price drop. When you're new to the full frame game and you've got all these people who are like, sorry, I'm already Sony, I'm already Canon, like you've got to try really, really hard to get people invested in an entirely new mount and lens ecosystem. I think they did it with the S1H in terms of focusing hard on video and for filmmakers, which is great. But now that these, Sony and Canon are doing very similar stuff, it's like drop the price, get people over to L mount, and really build out a healthy ecosystem there of lenses and even more cameras that are going to be able to take advantage of those lenses. Back in the chat. Let's see, have I tried the EVA1? No, I have not. Didn't really, it's cool, didn't really appeal to me, and I think a lot of people would just rather have a hybrid than like camcorder style. Olympus's video mode is at about GH4 level, but definitely photocentric cameras, yes. The RF mount allows for more room for IBIS, hence Canon's first attempt being better than Sony's, yep. The RF 28-70 does not have its own stabilization, but it still gets at least 7 stops IBIS. Eugene says, I agree, that is why I'm swinging to the A7S III. The GH5 has spoiled me with true video tools that I would miss. Indeed, the GH5 has spoiled me, and I think if you went to the S1H, you'd be even more spoiled because it's a beautiful camera in terms of the video features. Do I know how much about the S1H and the Ninja that you can record ProRes RAW? I'm aware that you can do this. I have not done it myself. I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but I know that yes, the S1H had a firmware update to where you can record ProRes RAW via HDMI to a Ninja 5. That is all I know. And then Eugene says line skipped. Oh, on the R5, yeah, line skipped down from the 45 megapixels down to 4K or whatever you're recording there. The S1H and the Ninja is an interesting situation because obviously if you know the benefits of RAW, it's an incredible feature to have. However, many projects, many people do not take into consideration the sheer cost of RAW and a RAW workflow in terms of hard drives, computer specs. Like I know ProRes RAW is a little bit easier to edit, but the hard drive cost is significant, and having those massive files, you have to be invested in media as well on set, depending on how many times you're wiping the drive on the Ninja 5, right? How many SSDs you need on set, and then where are they being dumped to? How many backups do you have? Is your system rated? Do you have an on-site and an off-site? There's a lot of data management involved with RAW that can be overwhelming, and you just need really, really high-end everything for transfer speeds, because it's not even about like just storing the data and having room for it. It's about making that process efficient to where you can transfer, right? If you have a clip from the GH5 that's 50 megabytes, it transfers really quick. If you've got ProRes RAW stuff that's 500 megabytes per clip, like you're just adding time to the process and the workflow. So just keeping all that in mind, RAW can be a really attractive thing because it is very, very powerful and very beneficial in a lot of situations. But then you also have the color grading aspects that can involve more time in post-production as well. So there's just a lot of cost associated with it. whether it's in time or financially, the costs that are associated with RAW and that kind of workflow. Just, it can be easy to gravitate towards and think it's so amazing, and then you realize, oh wow, I don't want this at all. I'm going to go back to the way I was shooting before, because it just doesn't make sense for a lot of projects. The Canons are dead in the water for high quality video production. Yes, I love Canon, but not for video. Yes, Eugene, that is why I added the GH5 to my kit, purely for video. Interesting. Well, I would say definitely try out the S1H, give it a rental, see if it suits your needs. It's different than the GH5 in a lot of ways. It's exactly what it's supposed to be. It's a bigger, better version of the GH5 that's full frame, that's more video centric, that's more powerful, more expensive. Everything about the camera is exactly what I personally would want coming from a GH5 style camera. However, time and place, we'll see. Is there a GH6 right around the corner? Is there going to be an S2 anytime soon? I think my best advice, and I'm going to end it here, is just only buy a camera when you actually need it. If you are doing fine with what you have, just keep waiting until you actually need a camera, and then buy a new one, whatever the best is at the time, because the inevitable consequence of all this stuff is that something better is always right around the corner. And the moment you buy something and you bought it just because it was new and shiny, well, guess what? A couple months later, there'll be the new shiny thing. And if you didn't actually need that camera and you just bought it because you wanted it, you will immediately have buyer's remorse, and you'll say, oh, I wish I'd bought this new thing instead. Oh, now my camera sucks. All that's not true. It's all just in your mind. It's all mental. It's the exact same camera you bought when you thought it was amazing. It just is garbage in comparison now because something new came out. So only buy a camera when it does something that you actually need and it serves a purpose in terms of you're making money working and you cannot do something, or your footage is compromised and you're barely getting by because you're still filming on a GH2 and you finally are making enough money to afford something and you absolutely have to have it because you have a project coming up for a really big client. Yes, that's the right time to buy the new thing. Don't just buy the new thing because it's the new thing and it's awesome and shiny. I'm talking to myself in a lot of ways right here as well, because don't get me wrong, I feel the same way. A7S III, ooh, should I pre-order this? Ooh, the Canon R5's coming. Oh, that's going to be awesome. Well, never mind, we can write that one off. But then, hey, that S1H, oh, that came out. That was really cool. I never really gave it a chance at the time because I didn't really need it. But now there's all this new stuff coming out. I feel like I need something new. Maybe I should get the S1H. Don't trick yourself into buying something that you don't actually need. Think about your actual needs, what's going to have value, what's going to make your money back, because then it'll be fine. Then you'll buy it, and it doesn't matter if something else comes out because you bought what you actually needed that's helping you, and you don't have to worry about what other people buy or what other systems come out because you have a tool that does the job that you actually need to get done. I'll end it there. Still rocking my GH4. That's excellent. Waiting on the GH6. Absolutely. That's a great way to do it. And then Tony says there's storage issues with RAW, but can it just record ProRes HQ 4K and 6K? Yeah, you can record ProRes 4K and 6K for sure. I don't know about 6K, but you could do that internally as well. Something to look into, I suppose. Steve just built 2 different Thunderbolt 3 RAID arrays, OWC and a Sonnet, both for dealing with B-RAW and ProRes RAW. Yeah, absolutely. It's expensive and it's an undertaking. So just keep all that in mind. Don't get attracted to the latest, greatest, newest, shiniest thing and just think you have to buy it just because it's new. That's a lie. And then also don't fool yourself into thinking you need RAW or you need 10-bit. You know, if you're shooting 8-bit and you're doing color and camera and all that stuff, like buy the upgrade when you know that you're going to commit to it because it's actually worth it at the time. You know, even the difference between micro four third and full frame and like these technical things that sometimes don't even translate to the final image. They, like, no one actually knows. They can't even tell. They're watching it. They're just going, oh, this looks nice. Could have been shot with a GH3 for all they know. And stuff keeps getting better. So don't rush into anything. Make sure you buy exactly what you want and what you need at the time you need it. See you guys.